Hello everyone, welcome to Frightening Tales. I know many of you enjoy listening to these videos as you fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from, and if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Alright, now let's get comfortable, relax and dive into tonight's case. Today I told you about murder cases which are unsolved. First case. The murder of Lynn Harper, 1959. The last bike ride. A tragic series of events followed by a biased police investigation resulted in a 14-year-old boy becoming the youngest ever inmate on Canada's death row. The murder of Lynn Harper and subsequent arrest of a 14-year-old boy contains many of the hallmarks of a wrongful conviction. The investigation focused on Stephen Truscott as the main suspect. Evidence was corrupted to look incriminating, and at a time when people had uncritical attitudes toward the justice system, he was convicted of her murder with almost no questions asked. Since then, however, some highly questionable police work has come to light, and the science that found the teenager guilty has been thoroughly discredited. But if Stephen Truscott was wrongly accused over half a century ago, then who really killed Lynn Harper? Summer bike ride. It was the summer of 1959, and Stephen Truscott's father was stationed at Clinton Air Force Base in Clinton, Ontario. The teenager attended the Air Vice Marshal Hugh Campbell School located on the north side of the base. It was here that he met 12-year-old Lynn Harper, the daughter of an officer at the Clinton base. On June 9, 1959, Lynn had dinner with her family before going outside at around 6:15 p.m. It was a pleasant summer evening and the sun had not yet set. According to Stephen, he started chatting with Lynn outside their school at around 7 p.m. He said that she asked if he could give her a ride on his bicycle to Highway 8, where she planned to hitchhike to a quaint white house just north of the highway. The owner of the house kept ponies and Lynn loved ponies. Stephen agreed. Lynn perched herself on the handlebars of his bicycle, and off they went. Several witnesses would later state that they spotted the pair biking on a country road running alongside the Bayfield River, a popular spot for swimming and fishing, which was on the way to Highway. What happened next is the crux of the case. Stephen asserts that he dropped Lynn off on Highway 8, and as he glanced back while biking toward Bayfield Bridge, he saw her climb into a late model Chevrolet with yellow plates. The car then drove east. Others have argued that instead, Stephen took Lynn into nearby woodland known as Lawson's Bush, where he raped and strangled her, discovering the body. When Lynn didn't return home that night, her worried father called police to report her missing. A search party was swiftly assembled, and an extensive search for the young girl ensued. 2 days later, a search party member from the Clinton base made a terrible discovery in Lawson's Bush. Partially hidden among the foliage was the semi-naked, lifeless body of Lynn Harper. She had been raped and subsequently strangled to death with her own white, sleeveless blouse, which was still around her pale neck. Her face and chest were dotted with maggots, and larvae had gathered near the buttocks. These gruesome details, ignored at the time, would one day be used as crucial evidence. The autopsy was conducted in a cramped and poorly lit room at a Clinton funeral home. The regional pathologist, Dr. John Penistan, issued 3 versions of the autopsy report, all of which had a different time of death. He finally concluded that Lynn had died on June 9 between 7:15 p.m. and 7:45 p.m. The first 2 autopsy reports declared that she had died after 8 p.m., but by the time the third autopsy report was issued, Police had announced that Stephen Truscott was the main suspect in the slaying. In order for him to become so, the timeline of events had to be tweaked to put the time of Lynn Harper's murder before 8 p.m. This was because Stephen had been seen riding his bicycle near the schoolyard at approximately 8 p.m. and was home shortly after that time to look after his siblings. June 12, 1959 / Stephen Truscott is arrested for the murder of Lynn Harper. Teenager on trial. Teenager on trial. Stephen Truscott was arrested and put on trial for the murder of his school friend, strongly protesting his innocence the entire time. The time of Lynn Harper's death and Stephen's whereabouts remain two key issues at his trial. Ultimately, the courtroom testimony of Dr. Pinistan was comparable to a noose tightening around Stephen's neck. The doctor claimed that the murder had occurred between 7 p.m. and 7:45 p.m. when Lynn Harper had been in the company of Stephen. He based this assertion on the fact that he had found a full meal in Lynn Harper's stomach. The stomach normally takes 2 hours to empty, and her last meal had been at 5:45 p.m. Subsequent medical research, however, has shown that the stomach may take up to 6 hours to empty. Despite a total lack of physical evidence against him, Stephen Truscott was found guilty and sentenced to hang. His death sentence was commuted to life in prison in 1960, the same year that his first appeal was denied. In 1966, the Supreme Court of Canada upheld his conviction. 3 years later, Stephen was released on parole. Following his release, he went on to marry and have 3 children while living under an assumed name. He kept a low profile until 2000 when his case was featured on the CBC TV investigative program The Fifth Estate, which portrayed the trial as a miscarriage of justice. In 2001, the Association in Defense of the Wrongfully Convicted successfully filed an appeal to have the case reopened. A question of timing. In 2006, 5 judges of the Ontario Court of Appeal began a landmark review of the case, and Stephen Truscott stood trial once again in a bid to clear his name. Much of the proceedings focused on evidence that was unavailable to his lawyers at his original trial. Dr. Michael Pollinan, Ontario's chief pathologist, took the stand to announce that in his opinion, the original pathologist did not have enough evidence to support his finding that Lynn Harper had died within a 45-minute window on the night of June 9, 1959. Dr. Pollinan said that the time of death window must be broadened to include June 9 and June 10. Blowflies, maggots, and insect activity on the body raised reasonable doubts that she died as early as the original pathologist had determined. During the 1950s, forensic entomology, the study of insects and decomposition, was practically non-existent. Despite this, the insects were thankfully still collected at the time. Knowing when insects deposit their eggs or larvae on a corpse gives a clearer estimation of the time of death. The maggots and larvae found on Lynn's body were in the first stage of development. Forensic entomologist Gail Anderson concluded that the insects began to colonize on Lynn's body on June 10, indicating that she had been killed much later than previously claimed. Truscott's story about his last moments with Lynn Harper were also redressed in the Ontario Court of Appeal. During the 1959 trial, Lynn's parents had insisted that their daughter would never hitchhike, refuting his account. However, Catherine Beamer, who had been a close friend of both Lynn and Stephen, stated that hitchhiking was common, and that she and Lynn had done it at least 15 to 20 times. New testimony that harmed the defense came from one of the original witnesses, Karen Dom. In 1959, Dom, who was 9 years old at the time, told police that she had seen Stephen and Lynn near the railway tracks, north of Lawson's Bush at about 7:15 p.m. However, in 2006, she testified that she had actually seen the pair further south. She recalled that Truscott had veered toward her, causing her to fall off her bike into a ditch south of the trail leading to Lawson's Bush. Suspects revealed. At the Ontario Court of Appeal, the defense argued that once the local police officers made Stephen Truscott their prime suspect, the murder investigation ground to a halt, and other leads and tips were ignored. Several alternative suspects in the case were acknowledged in the court documents but never publicly identified by name. They included a convicted pedophile who was stationed at the Clinton base at the time of the murder. This unidentified man came to the attention of the police in 1997 after a retired officer informed them that he believed the man was capable of murdering a child. Another suspect was a former salesman who drove a 1957 Chevy and often visited the Clinton base. He first came to police attention when he broke into the home of retired Detective Barry Rule and assaulted his wife before Rule overpowered and arrested him. Rule investigated this anonymous man and came to the conclusion that he was a suspect in several murders including that of Lynn Harper. Court documents also referred to a convicted rapist who lived in the nearby town of Seaforth and worked as an electrician on the Clinton base. He had visited the Harpers' home before the murder to repair a clothes dryer. Shortly after Lynn's murder, he moved to the U.S., where he was charged with sexual offenses, for which he was acquitted. The suspect minister. The fourth suspect mentioned in the documents was a minister who was later accused of sexual assault by his own adult daughters. One of them informed police that when she was 6 years old, she hid in her father's car. When he took it out for a drive, she claimed that he stopped on a gravel road and opened the trunk. She peeked out of the window and allegedly saw him carrying the body of a girl toward some trees. About half an hour later, he returned to the car alone. The final suspect and the only other one to ever be publicly identified was an airman who had once been stationed at Clinton Base. At the time of the crime, he was stationed at Aylmer and had a home in Seaford. He was an alcoholic with psychiatric problems and a sexual interest in children. 12 days before Lynn Harper was murdered, he was released after being arrested for attempting to lure little girls to his car in nearby St. Thomas. This suspect would later be identified as SGT Alexander Kalashuk, who had passed away in 1975. Many Clinton residents believe that the military deflected blame for Lynn Harper's murder to protect its reputation and, as evidence, point to the disappearance of military records from 1959. The long road to justice. In August 2007, Stephen Truscott was acquitted of all charges. His defense team wanted him to declared factually innocent, but the court ruled that was impossible because in a case of circumstantial evidence like this, there is certainly nothing on this record that would lead you to the conclusion that he's factually innocent. It is rare for a defendant to be declared innocent after being found guilty unless there is DNA evidence to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that another person perpetrated the crime. It was a long-awaited ending and most observers were satisfied with the outcome. Tough, as Stephen pointed out, the Crown had most of this information 48 years, 2 months, and 19 days ago. Stephen remained highly critical of the legal system that had put him through so much. The Crown chooses to not think about justice. It would almost appear they're more interested in convictions. Stephen Truscott. On that hot summer's evening in 1959, Stephen Truscott and Lynn Harper, perched precariously on his handlebars, biked away from their school, onto the highway, and into Canadian legal history. Any retrial is now unlikely, owing to the amount of time that has passed. Most of those involved in the case are long since dead and evidence has been lost or destroyed. The murderer that robbed Lynn Harper of her life also robbed Stephen Truscott of his childhood and left him living under a cloud of suspicion for nearly half a century. Case notes: the Ontario Provincial Police led a team of 250 military, police, and civilian searchers. Stephen and Lynn passed Lawson's Bush to get to the road by Bayfield River. This implies that if Stephen did kill Lynn, he must have biked past Bayfield River, and then made a U-turn to go back toward the woodland. One of the defense witnesses, 12-year-old Gordon Logan, testified that he had seen Stephen and Lynn cross Bayfield Bridge, and Stephen return alone about 5 minutes later. Most of the witnesses who claimed to have seen Lynn and Stephen cross the bridge were children. The Crown dismissed some as liars. Dom had given a written statement to the police, but was never called to testify at the 1959 trial. The minister lived in the township of Dungannon, just 19 miles, 30.6 kilometers, north of the Clinton base. The airman was said to visit Clinton quite frequently. The Harper family maintained the belief that Stephen Truscott was guilty. When he was acquitted in 2006, Lynn's father was taken to the hospital with breathing problems. In 2008, Truscott was awarded $6.5 million in compensation for his time spent behind bars. In 2006, Lynn's body was exhumed for further testing, in hopes that it could lead to the killer and prove Stephen innocent. No viable DNA was retrieved. Second case: the Lake Bodom murders, 1960. Campsite of horrors. This seemingly motiveless attack on 4 sleeping teenagers in a famous Finnish beauty spot has passed into the darkest annals of unexplained crime. Finland's beautiful Lake Bodom is situated near the southern city of Espoo. Between June and August the sun does not set, temperatures soar, and Finns of all ages flock to the lake to celebrate the arrival of summer and the passing of the long, freezing winter. It was in this carefree spirit that, on June 4, 1960, 4 teenagers pitched their tent on the lake's tranquil shore. Mela Irmeli Björklund and Anja Tuulaki Maki, both 15, and their boyfriends, Seppo Antero Boisman and Nils Wilhelm Gustafsson, both 18, had planned an evening of fishing and camping. After riding their motorcycles to Lake Bodom from their hometown of Van Tat, the teenagers chose a spot shaded by birch trees along the idyllic Finnish bay. They spent the evening chatting, swimming, and fishing, completely oblivious to the horrors that would soon unfold at their campsite. Between 4 a.m. and 6 a.m., the sleeping teenagers were brutally attacked. They were bludgeoned with a heavy object, possibly a large rock, and slashed and stabbed with a knife. The murder weapons would never be found. The following morning, a local carpenter named Risto Siren stumbled across the grim scene while out for a swim with his son. Miraculously, Nils was unconscious but still clinging to life. He was the sole survivor of the brutal attack, but was not without injuries. He suffered from concussion, fractures to the jaw, bruises on his face, and stab wounds. When he came to, he stated that he had no recollection of the attack, owing to shock. "My last memory is of when we went to bed and wished each other good night. After that, I don't remember if it was Wednesday or Thursday when I woke up," he stated. One of all of the victims, Nils' girlfriend, Mela, sustained the most vicious injuries. She was discovered lying on top of the tent with her underwear removed, and she had suffered significantly more stab wounds than the others. A cluster of wounds had been inflicted post-mortem, the majority on her neck. Mystery attacker. An investigation of the crime scene revealed that the killer had not entered the tent but had attacked the teenagers from outside of it as they slept. The tent had at least 25 slashes. Several items belonging to the teenagers appeared to have been stolen, including a wallet and items of clothing, including Nils' shoes. Strangely, the keys to the victims' motorcycles had been taken, but not the bikes themselves. Approximately 1/2 mile, 800 meters, from the crime scene, several of these items were found, including Nils' shoes, which were partially hidden. In front of the mangled tent was a set of bloody footprints that matched Nils' discarded shoes, implying that the killer had fled the scene while wearing them. 2 boys who had been birdwatching near the crime scene came forward to tell police that they had seen a blonde-haired man walking away from the collapsed tent at approximately 6 a.m. These young eyewitnesses would later undergo hypnosis in the hope that they could provide more information. While they couldn't give further details, their story remained the same, and a composite sketch of this unidentified man was drawn by a police sketch artist. After making a full recovery from his injuries, Nils would also undergo hypnosis. During his session, he recollected a vision of a figure coming toward him, clad in black and with glaring red eyes. 11 a.m., June 5, 1960. The bodies are discovered. The kiosk vendor. Over time, several individuals became suspects in the gruesome triple murder. One of the most plausible among the locals was Carl Valdemar Gillstrom, a kiosk vendor at Lake Bodom. Carl was known for his particularly aggressive behavior toward campers. On occasion, he would slash the ropes of tents so that they would collapse on the sleeping occupant. Ulf Johansson, the author of Legend of Bodom, recalled how he was once the victim of Carl's anger. When he was a teenager, Carl had thrown rocks at him as he biked past me and all the other Northerners. We always knew who the murderer was. Ulf Johansson, author of Legend of Bodom too. Many locals had found it extremely suspicious that, following the murders, Carl filled in a well on his property. Because the murder weapons had never been discovered, there were those who suspected that they had been interred in the well. In 1969, Carl drowned in Lake Bodom. He had never been fully investigated as a suspect in the murders. His wife had provided a seemingly ironclad alibi for him, claiming that he was in bed asleep. However, shortly before his wife passed away, she confessed that this alibi was false and claimed that he had threatened to kill her and their children if she refused to provide a cover story for him. The man with blonde hair. The man with blonde hair. Another prime suspect throughout the investigation was an alleged KGB spy named Hans Assmann, who once claimed he had served as a guard at Auschwitz. The day after the murders, Hans checked himself into the Helsinki Surgical Hospital, where his appearance was said to be extremely disheveled. Nurses recollected that he had black fingernails, and his clothing was stained with a red substance. The doctors who saw him that afternoon were adamant that the red stains on his clothes were blood. Moreover, Hans was said to have acted in a very suspicious manner at the hospital, giving a false name, telling contradicting stories about how he had injured himself, and feigning unconsciousness. After the description of the blonde-haired suspect spotted by the young birdwatchers was released to the media, Hans chopped off his own blonde locks. In addition, his clothing was said to match that worn by the elusive blonde-haired man. Perhaps most chillingly, a man who looked strikingly similar to Hans was photographed at the funeral of the victims. It isn't unheard of for killers to make an appearance at their victims' funerals. Perhaps out of morbid curiosity or with the intention of taunting investigators. Some murderers derive sadistic pleasure from knowing something that nobody else does. Despite all this powerful, admittedly circumstantial, evidence, Hans was never brought in for questioning. Several books have been written about Hans Assmann, and he has been linked to several other unsolved murders, including that of 17-year-old Olli Kylaki. In 2003, Dr. Jorma Palo, who had been training at the Helsinki Surgical Hospital when Hans came in for treatment, published a book in which he named Hans as the killer. 3. Allegedly while on his deathbed, Hans confessed to the murders. However, this claim cannot be verified. Look at the DNA. The case eventually went cold, but because Finland has no statute of limitations for murder, it was reopened in 2004. Sole survivor Nils Gustafsson, now married with 2 grown-up children, was arrested on suspicion of having committed the murders. Investigators claimed that the broken jaw he had sustained during the attack was the result of a fight with Seppo, his best friend. They now believed that Nils had killed. Fight with Seppo, his best friend. They now believed that Nils had killed the trio and arranged the crime scene, inflicting the knife wounds and blunt force trauma on himself to give the impression of a frenzied attack by an unknown killer. August 4, 2005/45 years after the murders were committed, the trial of Nils Gustafsson begins. Investigators announced that they had discovered a key piece of evidence that allegedly tied Nils to the murders. DNA testing had been carried out on Nils' discarded shoes that revealed traces of the victims' blood. During Nils' trial, his defense argued that the new DNA evidence didn't prove that Nils was guilty of the murders. They contended that the killer could have easily stolen and worn Nils' shoes, along with several other items of clothing that were taken. The prosecution refuted these arguments, stating that Nils had committed the murders and then discarded his shoes in an attempt to conceal his guilt. The defense used DNA evidence of their own to strengthen their case by presenting a pillowcase that had been found inside the teenager's tent. On it, they found sperm that didn't match either Nils or Seppo. They argued that this was evidence that somebody else had carried out the attack on the victims in a sexual frenzy. The fact that Nils' own blood was found on the inside of the tent indicating that he, too, had been inside the tent during the frenzied attack further strengthened their case. Victim or killer? Both the defense and the prosecution produced experts who gave conflicting statements with regard to the injuries that Nils had suffered on that fateful night. Neurology specialist Ali Tenovoyo claimed it was very plausible that Nils had suffered memory loss following the attack. The prosecution called in the respected physician Eero Hirvensalo, who told the court that he believed Nils' injuries were consistent with being punched with a fist, as opposed to being bludgeoned with a heavy object. These jaw fractures are low-energy injuries that did not require great violence, he claimed. The prosecution argued that such injuries were not serious enough to cause memory loss. Ultimately, the court agreed with the defense, accepting that the boys' eyewitness testimony of a blonde-haired man departing the scene was credible. It ruled that an unknown assailant had probably attacked the 4 teenagers as they slept in their tent, and rejected the prosecution's scenario that a fight between Nils and Seppo had triggered the murders. The court deduced that it was very unlikely that Nils could have inflicted his wounds on himself. He was very badly injured, and could not have done what he is being charged with. Rieta Leponimi, Nils' attorney. Furthermore, the court questioned how Nils could have disposed of the murder weapons in such a short time frame. Nils was duly acquitted of all charges, and was awarded €44,900, $52,500 in US dollars. Compensation for the suffering his arrest and trial had caused him. Deep waters. The Lake Bodom murders have haunted Finland for decades, inspiring books, conspiracy theories, movies, even a death metal band named Children of Bodom. The mystery surrounding the identity of the killer or killers, as well as the killer's motive, has elevated the case to quasi-mythical status. 3 generations of children have grown up being told not to stay out late for fear of the Bodom murderer. As long as the killer is unidentified, that fear shall remain. Case notes. Soldiers were brought in to search the area, but in doing so, they disturbed the crime scene. Shortly before his death, Karl allegedly confessed to a neighbor that he had killed the campers. Despite the doctors' and nurses' reports, Hans' blood-stained clothing was never examined by police. Nils Gustafsson spent more than 500 days in custody. Third case. The Zodiac Killer, 1968 to 1969. Killing for fun. A callous killer, seemingly acting at random, was roaming Northern California. He was also taunting the police by mailing clues to the press in a weird code of his own devising. In Benicia, California, a teenage couple sharing their first date parked on Lake Herman Road, a secluded lover's lane, were startled by a beam of light. They squinted and saw a man with a flashlight, perhaps a police officer. The pair were nervous, who wouldn't be? But their fears were innocently rooted in their parents finding out they'd been caught in such an intimate setting. Then the stranger pulled out a gun. Within seconds, 17-year-old David Faraday was fatally shot in the head. 16-year-old Betty Lou Jensen desperately tried to flee and staggered only a little way away before collapsing to the ground, killed by 5 bullets to her back. This is the Zodiac speaking. As horrific as the scene was to the sheriff's deputies who began investigating it on December 20, 1968, they were ignorant of its significance, assuming the killer must have been a jealous suitor of Betty Lou's. It would be 7 months before they would learn that this double shooting marked the first murders that would be claimed by an elusive criminal known as the Zodiac Killer. Most killers avoid direct contact with the police, but the Zodiac Killer was very different. He chose to deliberately taunt them. He started by sending 3 letters to California newspapers, the San Francisco Chronicle, San Francisco Examiner, and Vallejo Times-Herald. The writer of these letters claimed responsibility not just for the Benicia shooting, but also another. The second attack. Darlene Ferrin was a 22-year-old wife and mother who worked as a waitress in Vallejo, California. On July 5, 1969, she had picked up her friend, 19-year-old Michael Maggio, and parked in a secluded spot at Blue Rock Springs Park. A stranger approached with a flashlight, stuck a semi-automatic pistol through the open driver's side window of the car, and opened fire. Ferrin was killed, but despite being shot in the jaw, hip, leg and shoulder, Maggio survived, though his physical recovery would take months. July 31, 1969 / the first letters from the Zodiac Killer are published in the California press. In his letters, the Zodiac Killer not only claimed credit for the murders, He also revealed specific details that only the shooter and the investigating officers could possibly know, such as Super X being the brand of ammunition used in the Benicia killing, and Western the ammunition in the Vallejo murder. Split among the three letters was a cipher that the writer claimed would identify him. He demanded that the newspapers run the cipher in full. If they did not, he promised to go on a killing spree. Within days, the newspapers had complied. The code was a mishmash of English and Greek letters, as well as symbols from astrology, the Egyptian Book of the Dead, Asian mythology, and from Native American rock carvings. Making it even harder to decipher were myriad misspellings and grammatical errors. Nevertheless, within a week, a high school teacher named Donald Harden had cracked the code. With his wife. It read, "I like killing people because it is sick more fun than killing wild game in the forest sick. Because man is the most dangereux animal sick of all, to kill something gives me the most thrilling experience sick. The best part I the sick, when I die I will be reborn in paradise sick. And all the sick I have killed will become my slaves sick. I will not give you my name because you will trs sick to slow sick down or stop my collecting of slaves for my afterlife." The last line is still a mystery, ebeoriete pity. If the killer wanted infamy, his cipher delivered in full. Psychiatrists took to TV and newspapers to offer their analyses, which included terms and phrases like omnipotence and delusions of grandeur. One told the Los Angeles Times that the killer was most likely an isolated individual. He probably feels his fellow man looks down on him for some reason. A psychiatrist in the Los Angeles Times. The same unnamed psychiatrist said if the letters and cipher had been faked, it was done by a very, very disturbed person. If the writings were real, the man probably will kill again. And he did. The Man in the Mask. Saturday, September 27th, was warm and sunny, the perfect day for Cecilia and Shepard, 22, and Brian Hartnell, 20, to have a picnic. Lake Berryessa Park, about 20 miles north of Napa, California, offered a picturesque scene for their evening outing as they spread out their blanket and food at a spot near the water. At about 6:30 p.m., an ominous figure approached. The man was at least 6 feet tall, wore dark gloves and, over his head, a dark blue hood with large slits for his eyes and mouth. A peculiar image was painted on the hood, a cross circle hand-painted in white. The man waved a pistol at them and announced that he'd escaped from a prison in Montana after killing a guard. He only wanted their money and car keys so he could flee to Mexico. The couple agreed, but the man insisted on tying them up to prevent them from alerting others after he had left. He used a plastic prevent them from alerting others after he had left. He used a plastic clothesline to bind their hands behind their backs, and then between their legs. Then he calmly said he had to stab them. "Please stab me first. I'm chicken. I couldn't stand to see her stabbed," Brian pleaded. The masked man replied, "I'll do just that." Once Brian passed out from a dozen knife wounds to his back, the attacker sliced Cecilia and as though he were frenzied first in the back, and then flipping her over to stab her in her breasts, stomach, and groin. The wounds to her front created an outline like the one painted onto his hood. The crosshairs of a gun sight. He then left a message. Scrawled onto the door of Brian's car were words, dates and a time, each related to his attacks on David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen, and Darlene Ferrin and Michael Maggio. Vallejo. December 20th, 68. July 4th, 69. Sep 27-69, 6:30. By knife. The killer wanted credit for his work. An hour after the attack, he used a payphone outside of a car wash in Napa to call the police and report his own crime. I want to report a murder, no, a double murder. They are 2 miles, 3.2 kilometers, north of park headquarters. They were in a white Volkswagen Carmen Ghia. And I'm the one that did it? Clues from the killer. 2 weeks later, the same man killed a cab driver named Paul Stein in San Francisco. Police likely wouldn't have suspected that the serial killer slaughtering young couples was also behind the slaying of the lone 29-year-old man, but the Zodiac killer himself ensured that they knew exactly who the culprit was. He had torn a piece of bloodied shirt from Stein's lifeless body and, 2 days after the slaying, mailed it to the San Francisco Chronicle. By now, the killer had left behind a scattering of clues. At Lake Berryessa, police found a size 11 footprint with an unusual sole pattern. They identified the brand as having been sold at Sears. The investigators pulled fingerprints from the payphone in Napa and Stein's taxi cab. Unfortunately, their biggest break was also their biggest blunder. 3 people witnessed Stein's murder and called police, providing a description of the killer: white male, 25 to 30 years old, about 5 feet 9 inches, 1.75 meters, with a stocky build. His hair was styled in a crew cut, and he wore heavy-rimmed glasses. Somehow, this information was miscommunicated and officers were told to be on the lookout for a black man. So when 2 cops spotted a white man walking away from the scene, they didn't bother to stop him. The Zodiac killer kept taunting in his letters, boasting that the police would never catch him because he was too smart for them. He also threatened school children, promising to shoot out the tire of a school bus and pick off the kiddies as they come bouncing out. This terrifying threat prompted officers throughout the area to guard school buses, while volunteer teachers and parents rode inside the vehicles. At the height of the Zodiac panic, a man identifying himself as the killer called into a television show hosted by Jim Dunbar of KGO-TV in the San Francisco Bay Area. The caller insisted that he speak on air with famed attorney Melvin Belli. Over the course of 2 hours and more than a dozen phone calls, the caller said he was sick and suffered from headaches and that killing alleviated the pain. Belli tried to coax him into surrendering to police. The caller at times seemed receptive, but then blurted, "I don't want to give myself up. I want to kill those kids." The entire exchange was televised. Avery investigates. Stein is the last of the 7 confirmed Zodiac victims, 5 fatalities and 2 injuries, but others are suspected. Paul Avery, a veteran crime reporter at the Chronicle, wrote in 1970 that the same killer may have been at work in 1966, too. Avery reported that notes similar to the ones from the Zodiac were sent to the Riverside Press Enterprise and to police. After the 1966 slaying of 18-year-old Cherie Jo Bates, Cherie had been lured from her stalled car into a deserted parking lot, where she was stabbed to death. The notes sent afterward said, "Bates had to die there. Will be more." Avery reported that 2 of the notes were signed with a Z. Paul Avery also connected the Zodiac to the kidnapping of a 23-year-old mother. Kathleen Johns was driving with her 1-year-old daughter from San Bernardino to the San Francisco area when another car flashed its lights at her, prompting her to pull over. A man approached and warned her that one of her car wheels was wobbling and fixed it for her. Kathleen started driving again only to have that same tire completely come off the car. The man who had helped her stopped again and offered to take her to a gas station. Kathleen agreed, but got a sinking feeling when the man passed by one gas station after another. When she questioned him, he told her he planned to kill her. Kathleen managed to bolt from the car with her daughter and hide in a ditch. When she finally reached a police station to report the incident, she spotted a wanted poster featuring a picture of the Zodiac and screamed, "Oh, my God. That's him." Another suspected but unconfirmed Zodiac case centers on 25-year-old Donna Lass, who disappeared from South Lake Tahoe in September 1970. 6 months later, Avery received a postcard he believed was from the Zodiac. The message consisted of cut and pasted newspaper clippings and seemed to say that Lass's body could be found around in the snow. The note was signed with the cross and circle, symbol of the Zodiac's past letters. Some thought it could have been a copycat, especially because it came on the heels of another confirmed and well-publicized Zodiac communique sent to Avery at the Chronicle. Newspapers across the country ran stories about Avery receiving a ghoulish Halloween card in late October 1970. Written neatly in white ink was the message, "Peekaboo, you are doomed." It was signed, "From your secret pal." The card was adorned with images of skeletons, as well as a handwritten reference to paradise slaves, sick, and the phrases "by fire, by gun, and by rope." Police considered it a threat on Avery's life, but the eccentric reporter declined protection. "I'm really not scared. I've needled him in some of my stories and maybe that's why he wrote to me," he told a reporter, adding, "I do think I'll be a little careful for a while." Late January 1974 / the final confirmed Zodiac letter arrives at the San Francisco Chronicle's office. In the last of his 18 confirmed letters, the killer praised the classic 1974 horror movie The Exorcist as the best satirical comedy he'd ever seen, and claimed his body count had reached 37. After this revelation, the Zodiac killer seemingly disappeared. The cartoonist's suspect. The abrupt end to the Zodiac's killing spree only fueled his mystique. Theories about the killer's true identity are never-ending. Many have stepped forward, claiming to have solved the mystery. Robert Graysmith, a cartoonist working at the Chronicle when the Zodiac killer announced himself, became obsessed with the case. Graysmith wrote 2 best-selling books that posited that the killer was Arthur Lee Allen. Allen, who died in 1992, had been less than honorably discharged from the U.S. Navy in 1958 and fired from a teaching job for molesting a student in 1968. Allen wore a Zodiac brand watch, the logo of which was similar to the crosshair's signature the killer favored. In 1974, the same year that the final Zodiac letter was sent, Allen was arrested for molesting a 12-year-old boy. He pleaded guilty to the charge and served a 2-year prison sentence. In 1991, he was also identified in a photo lineup by Michael Maggio, one of the Zodiac killer's survivors. In 2007, when a film adaptation of Graysmith's book hit theaters and renewed interest in the cold case, Detective George Bawart said that he was 95% sure Allen was the killer. "What really bothers me about this case is that we were ready to charge Arthur Lee Allen, but he died before we could do that." Lingering doubts. In 2014, a man named Gary Stewart wrote a book, The Most Dangerous Animal of All. 6, claiming his biological father was the elusive Zodiac killer. Stewart had been abandoned in a stairwell as a newborn, and as an adult, he learned that his father was Earl Van Best Jr., a book salesman, who Stewart said had disturbing fixations and rage issues. Stewart pointed to his father's appearance, a dead ringer for the police sketch, circulated in 1969, and said that he found his father's initials Ev, Best, and Jr. in a Zodiac cipher sent to the San Francisco Examiner. San Francisco police commented that they were investigating the claim. Several other men, all now dead, also have been tied to the case. One was Louis Myers, whose friends said that before his death in 2002, he had confessed to being the Zodiac killer, supposedly targeting couples after breaking up with his girlfriend. Myers had connections with several of the victims, attending the same high schools as David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen, and allegedly working in the same restaurant as Darlene Ferrin. Furthermore, no Zodiac letters were received for a period between 1971 and 1973, the same time that Myers was stationed overseas with the military. A suspect named Ross Sullivan had been hospitalized for bipolar disorder and schizophrenia several times. He also wore boots whose soles were similar to the footprints found at Lake Berryessa. Another suspect with a connection to the Lake Berryessa stabbings was Donald Lee Bajak. He was a felon who was released from a Montana prison in 1968 after serving 11 years for killing a sheriff's deputy. Cecilia Shepard and Brian Hartnell's attacker told them that he had just escaped a Colorado prison. Police are still hoping to finally solve the aging case with modern technology. In 2018, Vallejo detectives sent 2 envelopes containing Zodiac letters to a lab in the hope that saliva from the envelope flap and stamps might contain the killer's DNA. Detective Terry Poisser said if the lab could create a genetic profile based on that DNA, investigators might be able to track down the killer through genealogy websites. It really comes down to DNA, Poisser said. Without it, you have nothing. Case notes. Majo told police that when he cried out in pain, the assailant returned to fire 2 more shots at each victim before leaving them for dead. The letters included details such as David lying on his back with his feet toward the car, Betty Lou lying on her right side, and Darlene wearing patterned pants. Cecilia and Brian had dated during college but moved on to become friends. The masked man parked his car behind Brian Hartnell's white VW. After the attack, Brian and Cecilia managed to untie each other. Brian attempted to find help, but had lost too much blood to get far. A fisherman heard Cecilia and Brian's screams and alerted park rangers. The 2 officers later worked with a sketch artist to create a drawing of the man they saw. This prompted tips to pour in, but none led to an arrest. Belly was best known for representing Jack Ruby, the man who shot and killed Lee Harvey Oswald, President John F. Kennedy's assassin. Police were never able to say whether the calls were legitimate or a hoax. Santa Barbara Sheriff's Detective Bill Baker theorized that the Zodiac was responsible for the 1963 murders of high school seniors Robert Domingos and Linda Edwards, who were tied up and shot on a beach. Donna Lass' body has never been found. The note to Avery was authenticated by a handwriting expert who had studied the Zodiac's earlier messages. Several supposed Zodiac letters have been deemed forgeries. Allen was reported to the police by his friend Don Chaney, who became concerned when Allen began talking about wanting to kill people. Zodiac, the 2007 movie adaptation of Robert Graysmith's book, was directed by David Fincher. Graysmith was played by Jake Gyllenhaal. An expert matched the handwriting in the Zodiac killer's letters to Earl Van Best's signature on his marriage certificate. A suspect named Lawrence Kane had allegedly pestered Darlene at her work. 4th case. The Oakland County child killer, 1976 to 1977. Stranger danger. Like any loving parents, those in Oakland County, Michigan, often told their children to stay away from strangers. These routine, everyday warnings were suddenly justified in the cruelest way possible. The case of the so-called Oakland County child killer, named after the Michigan county in which 4 terrifying kidnappings and murders occurred, panicked parents throughout the Midwest. The details were baffling. The 2 male victims bore signs of sexual assault, but the 2 females did not. 3 were suffocated or strangled, while 1 died of a shotgun blast to the head. All appeared to have been bathed at some point and were discovered neatly dressed. The first victim, 12-year-old Mark Stebbins, and his older brother Mike regularly hung out together at an American Legion Hall at 9 Mile and Woodward, about a mile from their home in Ferndale, Michigan. The Veterans Organization was a safe place for the boys to spend time, and on a snowy Sunday in February 1976, they walked to the hall to play pool. After a while, Mark, described as a good student who liked to spend time alone, said he wanted to walk home to watch television. It was a path he had taken countless times before, both with his brother and by himself. But on this day, Mark did not arrive home, and his mother, Ruth, called police in a panic. While Mark Stebbins' disappearance worried those who knew him, it was not the type of case that would normally receive widespread media attention. That changed 4 days later, when an office worker in the nearby town of Southfield spotted his body abandoned in a parking lot. February 19, 1976. Mark Stebbins' body is found. Mark had rope burns on his wrists, but he was not bound, and it appeared that he had been strangled or suffocated at least a day earlier. Ferndale Police Chief Donald Geary told reporters the boy's body likely had been kept in the trunk of a car before being ditched in the parking lot. Not only had he been scrubbed clean, but his fingernails had been scraped by his killer. As the police investigated and Mark's family mourned, months passed by and the tragic case slipped quietly from the headlines. Connected killings. On December 26, 1976, a motorist found the body of 12-year-old Jill Robinson in Troy, Michigan. She had left her Royal Oak home 4 days earlier after a row with her mother over what to have for dinner. On the surface, it was tough to discern if Jill's death was related to Mark's. The little girl had died in a completely different manner, a shotgun blast to the head rather than asphyxiation. But a few striking similarities led police to believe that there must be a connection. Jill's parents were also divorced. Like Mark, she was described as a loner, and it appeared she had been kidnapped and held for days before being killed. As with Mark, she had been fed and given water to drink while held captive. Her body, like Mark's, was dumped on a day it had snowed, helping to obscure much needed evidence. The killer's pace quickened. The next victim disappeared just a week later, on January 2, 1977, after leaving a party store just 4 blocks from her house in nearby Berkeley, Michigan. 10-year-old Christine Mihalik had bought a magazine and was walking along a busy thoroughfare in broad daylight when she vanished. Because Jill's body had been found so recently, Christine's disappearance was treated with far more urgency. Officers canvassed the neighborhood looking for witnesses and clues but found nothing. A week after Christine vanished, police assumed the worst. And that scared them. If someone can be snatched off a busy street at 3 p.m. on a Sunday afternoon, how can you protect anyone? SGT. David Pish. These fears were realized when snow fell on January 22, 1977, 19 days after Christine's disappearance. Mail carrier Jerry Wozni discovered Christine's body in a ditch along a dead-end road in Franklin, Michigan. Another Oakland County town. I saw a hand. It scared the hell out of me, Wozni told reporters. He said it appeared that snow had been tossed on top of her body to make her difficult to spot. The headlines the next day read, "Slayings Terrorize County." The final disappearance. Less than 2 months later, that terror reached the King family. On March 16, 1977, 11-year-old Tim asked his sister Kathy for 30 cents so he could buy candy from a drugstore 3 blocks from home. He left his house in Birmingham, Michigan, at about 8:15 p.m. and skateboarded to the Hunter Maple Pharmacy. The store clerk, Amy Walters, saw him leave with his candy at about 8:30 p.m. through a rear door that led to a darkened parking lot. Tim never returned home. Tim King's body was found a week later. Like the other victims, he had been kept alive much of the time he had been missing. Officials believed that he was suffocated within an hour of being found. While Tim was missing, his mother had written a letter to the Detroit News, pleading for him to come home for some Kentucky Fried Chicken, his favorite meal. An autopsy of the body revealed the food that he had eaten just before he was killed: fried chicken. Tim's meticulously clean body was found in a ditch along a well-traveled dirt road in Livonia, Michigan, with his skateboard placed next to it. The location marked a slight change in pattern, as Livonia fell in. The location marked a slight change in pattern, as Livonia fell in Wayne County, rather than neighboring Oakland. Police and sheriffs. Deputies from both jurisdictions were therefore dedicated to the case. Police descriptions. Enough witnesses finally came forward for the police to create a sketch of a suspect. The face that emerged belonged to a white man with dark hair, a prominent nose, and thick lips. Bushy mutton chops ran down his cheeks. An accompanying psychological profile told the community they were looking for someone from 20 to 35 years old, who was well educated and worked in a white-collar job with enough flexibility to give him the freedom to carry out his terrible crimes. "We believe that he appears sane 99% of the time," said Birmingham Police Chief Jerry Tobin, who suggested that the killer might be seeing a psychiatrist. Tobin urged anyone in the medical or legal professions to come forward with any information. For the police also began to suspect that the killer was being protected by someone close to him, a relative or a friend. No individual could have kept 4 children for varying lengths of time without someone knowing. Birmingham Police Chief Jerry Tobin. It was probably because of that suspicion that family members of the victims were stonewalled by investigators. This was very frustrating to Tim's parents, who had been especially cooperative in humoring investigators' hunches early on. Detectives had believed that whoever was holding Tim hostage would react badly to his parents' emotional pleas, so the couple had agreed to conceal their grief and keep their tone positive during news conferences. The Kings felt that they had received little cooperation from the authorities in return and subsequently sued the county prosecutor's office, hoping to force it to release more. The county prosecutor's office, hoping to force it to release more evidence from the case. In 2012, the office did release 6,000 pages of case documents. Suspect speculation. Little official information meant that over the years, rumors have abounded over the identity of the Oakland County child killer. Was he a mysterious man named John, or a priest, or someone posing as a police officer? Few actual names were publicly tied to the case. Among the first was David Norberg, an auto worker who drove a car that looked similar to one described near Tim's abduction site. Norberg had been suspected of killing two girls in the late 1970s, though he was not convicted. After he died in a car crash in 1981, his wife found a small silver cross inscribed with the name Christine. She remembered the girl who had been the Oakland County child killer's third victim and showed the cross to Christine's aunt, who said it was identical to one Christine had worn at the Romeo Peach Festival shortly before her death. Police exhumed Norberg's body in 1999 to see if his DNA matched evidence from the case, but the results did not tie him to the murders. Some investigators say that there is no way that Norberg, a heavy drinker, would have been able to lure stranger danger-conscious children into his car, and he has largely been dismissed as a suspect. A convicted pedophile named Christopher Bush was on the short list for the King family and Erica McAvoy, Christine's half-sister. The son of a wealthy auto executive, Bush lived in the area at the time. He was questioned soon after Tim's death, and he admitted to investigators that he was a pedophile. He also drove a car that looked similar to one spotted at one of the abductions. Investigators wanted to keep him in jail, but L. Brooks Patterson, who headed the prosecutor's office during the killings, released him as part of a plea deal. In November 1978, just a few months later, Bush killed himself in his home. A drawing of a screaming boy that resembled Mark Stebbins was reportedly found pinned to the wall. Case notes: the killer targeted mostly affluent areas of the southern portion of the county. It is possible that Jill was killed with a shotgun when strangulation didn't work. The search for Christine included helicopter sweeps. The Detroit News offered a reward of $100,000 to catch the killer. A blue AMC Gremlin was seen parked in the lot where Tim King was last seen. In 2013, parts of a similar car were found buried in a field in Grand Blanc, Michigan. Tim's parents insisted that they had warned their son repeatedly to never talk to strangers. All four victims had white dog hair on their otherwise clean bodies. Two other abductions were linked to the case: Cynthia Cadieux, 16, battered to death, and Jane Allen, 14, killed by carbon monoxide poisoning. The King's request that officials be forced to release more evidence was denied by the Michigan Supreme Court in 2017. A side effect of the investigation was the exposure of a child pornography ring based on North Fox Island, Lake Michigan. The special task force assigned to the case disbanded in December 1978. Police received more than 18,000 clues to the killer from the public. DNA tests in 2013 quashed allegations that notorious serial killer of teenage boys John Wayne Gacy was the murderer. Sloan was convicted of first-degree criminal sexual conduct, the legal term used in Michigan for rape, sexual assault, or sexual battery. In 2012, an unidentified investigator known as Bob claimed that there were between 11 and 16 victims, and that the killings were connected to satanic rituals. These claims were dismissed due to lack of evidence. In 2013, the King family produced a documentary titled Decades of Deceit, detailing what they perceived as the bungled investigation into their son's murder. Fifth case: the Tylenol murders, 1982. Death at the drugstore. Tylenol is one of the leading over-the-counter remedies for pain and fever. However, in September 1982, after taking the harmless drug, people in Chicago started dropping down dead. Mary Kellerman woke up one Wednesday morning in 1982 feeling a bit under the weather. Her parents did what many do when hearing sore throat complaints: they gave her extra-strength Tylenol to ease the pain before it was time for her to head off to school in the Chicago suburb of Elk Grove Village, Illinois. Mary padded into the bathroom and closed the door. Her father heard a sudden, loud thump. Paramedics tried to save Mary, but nothing helped. The 12-year-old girl was pronounced dead by 10 a.m. Across town, a 27-year-old postal worker named Adam Janis woke up sick enough to call off work. He picked up his kids from morning preschool and stopped by a pharmacy in another Chicago suburb to get some medicine. He fixed his children lunch, then prescribed himself two Tylenol and a nap. Minutes later, he collapsed in his kitchen. Medics suspected a heart attack, despite his young age and seemingly good health. No one could have known that Mary and Adam's deaths were tragically linked, despite the two having never met. They would be the first of 7 victims killed by extra-strength Tylenol capsules poisoned with potassium cyanide. Devastated family members gathered in mourning at Adam Janis' home. The dead man's younger brother, 25-year-old Stanley, felt chronic back pain flaring up, and Stanley's 19-year-old wife Teresa had a headache, brought on by the stress of the heartbreaking day. The couple both swallowed some Tylenol from Adam's cabinet. Stanley collapsed first, then Teresa. Thomas Kim, medical director of the Northwest Community Hospital's intensive care unit, had been the one to sign Adam's paperwork, indicating that he had suffered a heart attack. He was about to leave for home when he heard that more members of the Janis family were being rushed to his unit. Kim later told reporters of his shock at these sudden developments. He had met Stanley just hours earlier. "I had been talking to this 6-foot, healthy guy," he said. When he learned Stanley's wife was also dangerously ill, he knew he was dealing with something far more sinister than a heart attack. The same day that Mary Kellerman and Adam Janis died, September 29, 1982, a woman named Mary Lynn Reiner suffered the same fate. At 3:45 p.m., the broad-smiled 27-year-old, who had given birth just days earlier, popped some Tylenol for her pain. She collapsed and died soon after. As investigators searched the Janis house, another woman, 31-year-old Mary McFarland, told her co-workers at an Illinois Bell store in Lombard that she had a headache and went into a back room to take some Tylenol. She collapsed within minutes, and died. Making connections. In hindsight, it is easy to see Tylenol as a common thread. However, for investigators at the time, the use of this over-the-counter medication was so mundane that it did not jump out as the cause of death. What Dr. Kim did soon figure out was that the victims all showed symptoms of potassium cyanide poisoning, abdominal pain, dizziness, and heart failure. Blood tests confirmed his diagnosis and, as he later told reporters, he paced his office, trying to work out how these disparate people had all been exposed to the same toxin. By the end of Wednesday, barely 12 hours after little Mary Kellerman was pronounced dead, 2 suburban firefighters who had been monitoring chatter on the fire radios they kept in their homes started comparing notes on the phone. The firefighters shared their theory with Kim, who knew the Janises had taken Tylenol but hadn't known about the other victims. Authorities retrieved the red and white bottles from all of the victims' homes and realized they came from the same lot and shared expiration dates. 2. I said, "This is a wild stab, but maybe it's Tylenol." Firefighter Richard Keyworth. Nicholas Bichos, an investigator for the Cook County Medical Examiner's Office, had studied cyanide in a college biology class. He and Chief Medical Examiner Edmund Donoghue were discussing the murders over the phone when Donoghue remembered that cyanide has a Distinctive smell. Pashos opened the bottles. I said, whoops. I smell something. It smells like almonds, he later told a reporter. 3. Lab tests confirmed that whoever was behind the tampering had made it a gunless game of Russian roulette. In each bottle, a handful of the capsules had been emptied and replaced with a lethal dose of cyanide. Between 5 and 7 micrograms of cyanide is fatal, and the contaminated capsules contained as much as 65 milligrams of the poison, several thousand times more than a fatal dose. The people who consumed these capsules typically collapsed within minutes. Panic in Chicago. By Thursday, just one day after the first deaths, the media were warning all of Chicago and soon the country about the Tylenol connection. Chicago police, worried residents might miss the news, went through the streets broadcasting the message over loudspeakers. Investigators with the U.S. Food and Drug Administration warned consumers to avoid buying Tylenol and not to take any already in their homes. Pharmacy owners. Tylenol and not to take any already in their homes. Pharmacy owners pulled the drug from their shelves, and Johnson & Johnson, the parent firm for Tylenol maker McNeil Consumer Products Co. offered refunds to panicked customers. Poisoned pills. McNeil officials ruled out tampering during production. The company routinely kept a random sample of pills from every lot produced. They tested the lot in question, MC 2880, expiration date April 1987, after the deaths. They were clean, said McNeil spokeswoman Elsie Bemer. This finding led authorities to believe that someone in Chicago had bought the Tylenol bottles legitimately, taken them home, tampered with the capsules, and then put them back on shelves throughout the city. Unwitting customers bought them, never knowing when they paid for their simple bottle of headache medicine that they were sealing their or their loved one's fate. Meanwhile, the body count grew. On Friday, October 1, 35-year-old Paula Prince was found in her Chicago apartment. She had last been seen at a Walgreens on North Wells Street on Wednesday, just after the flight attendant had landed in O'Hare from Las Vegas. Surveillance photos showed Prince buying a bottle of Tylenol at about 9:30 p.m. that night. She had no way of knowing that across town, doctors were on the cusp of tying tainted Tylenol capsules to a spate of sudden deaths. September 30, 1982 / the final victim, Paula Prince, dies after taking Tylenol. Prince died soon after taking the pills, but her body was not discovered. For 2 days, her sister was supposed to meet her for dinner, and Paula wasn't answering her telephone. Friend and fellow flight attendant Jonah Hearn later commented. According to Richard Bertschek, superintendent of the Chicago Police Department, Paula Prince had gone to the bathroom to remove her makeup and pop the meds while in there. The Tylenol bottle was still sitting open on the vanity, Bertschek commented. She took it in the bathroom, and by the time she got to the threshold of the door, she was dead. Dead ends. As panicked as Chicago was, the rest of the nation could take comfort in knowing that the attack appeared to be isolated until it didn't. A few days into the high-profile investigation, news spread that other victims were falling ill nationwide from various poisons, including rat poison and hydrochloric acid. Authorities investigated and found that these incidents were caused by opportunistic copycats. It seemed that anyone with a grudge was jumping aboard the pill-tainting bandwagon. Some even branched out to new methods, hiding sharp pins in Halloween candy, leading some communities to ban trick-or-treating altogether. As soon as the method and means were pinpointed in the Tylenol poisonings case, the police expressed confidence that the perpetrator would be swiftly apprehended. But that didn't happen. 5 days after the deaths began, when the tally had reached 7, Illinois Attorney General Tyrone Fauner announced that the police were searching for a man who had been arrested in August for shoplifting Tylenol. It seemed a promising lead on the surface, but Fauner tempered public expectations. "We're not quite sure what to think. Sometimes people steal anything. They may have just been stealing Tylenol to steal it." The shoplifter story made big headlines but was quickly discounted. It turned out that he'd been behind bars since his August arrest. He was just one of several fruitless leads pursued. Investigators also sought to interview disgruntled employees with both Johnson & Johnson and McNeil. They took notes on tips about suspicious-looking customers. One pharmacy employee was arrested after police got a tip he kept cyanide in his house. The man was eventually cleared after the supposed cyanide turned out to be a non-toxic cleaning agent. Investigators weighed theories that there was more than one capsule tampere, a hypothesis posited because some of the capsules had clearly been modified, while the spiking of others was far better disguised. The nation's top sleuths came up empty-handed. Disguised. The nation's top sleuths came up empty-handed. Innocent victim. One of the more promising early suspects was a man named Roger Arnold, who had worked alongside the father of one of the victims in a Jewel food store's warehouse. Arnold, then 48, was arrested in October 1982 after a tip-off that he had cyanide in his home. Police interrogated Arnold for 3 days, after which they dismissed any link between him and the Tylenol deaths. Arnold considered his life ruined, however, and wanted revenge against the secret informant. In January 1983, he targeted a Chicago man he believed had directed investigators his way. Arnold shot and killed John Stanishaw, a 46-year-old computer consultant and father of 3 who police say was never an informant. Arnold lamented the death years later. "I killed a man, a perfectly innocent person," he said from prison in 1996. "I had choices. I could have walked away." The most likely break in the case came courtesy of a brazen extortionist. Within 2 weeks of the deadly outbreak, Tylenol's makers, Johnson & Johnson, received a letter promising to stop the killings for $1 million. The letter, immediately given to the FBI, was traced to James W. Lewis of New York City. Lewis' letter was dismissed as heartless opportunism, but he still routinely appears as the front runner on lists of suspects, largely because no one else has emerged to unseat him. There are certain suspicious factors. At one point in his checkered past, Lewis and his wife Leanne had imported pill-making machines from India, and when he and his wife had first moved to Chicago, they had lived under false names as Robert and Nancy Richardson. Additionally, Lewis had once been charged with bludgeoning and dismembering a Kansas City man. Those charges were dismissed after a judge ruled that Lewis' arrest and the seizure of his property were illegal. As recently as 2009, federal authorities searched Lewis' home hoping to discover new clues. Nothing was found. 2 years later, the FBI took a DNA sample from Ted Kaczynski, the man famously dubbed the Unabomber for mailing 16 homemade bombs that killed 3 people and injured more than 20 between 1978 and 1995. Imprisoned since 1996, Kaczynski was on the police's radar because he imprisoned since 1996, Kaczynski was on the police's radar because he had lived with his parents in suburban Chicago during the Tylenol murders. Every lead led to big headlines, but nothing more. Safety first. The only solid progress ever made in the case involved packaging. Within days of the deaths, legislators proposed new laws requiring manufacturers to seal drug containers. The little foil seals are commonplace now, but prior to young Mary Kellerman collapsing in her bathroom, all that stood between a malevolent would-be tamperator and a stranger's medicine was a twist-off lid and a wad of cotton. Pashos, one of the original investigators, recently lamented that the killer remains nameless after all these years. It's frustrating for everybody, he said, more so for the families who were victims not being able to put this person or persons behind bars. Case notes. Taking cyanide causes heart muscle cells and nerve cells to be robbed of oxygen. Muscles seize up, bodies convulse and contract, and the heartbeat weakens until it stops completely. Newspaper headlines warned, cyanide deadly just to touch. The Food and Drug Administration, FDA, tallied more than 270 different incidents of copycat tampering. More than 100 investigators, including those who had helped build cases against the serial killers Richard Speck and John Wayne Gacy, joined forces to solve the mystery. John Stanishaw has been referred to as the eighth Tylenol victim. Arnold served 14 years of a 30-year prison sentence and died in 2008. Lewis did not ask for the $1 million to be paid to himself, but into the account of a businessman whom he claimed had swindled him and his wife. Lewis served 12 years for extortion but has never been directly tied to the Tylenol deaths. In 2010, James Lewis published a novel titled Poison: The Doctor's Dilemma. It was about people dying after unknowingly drinking poisoned water. Sixth case. The murder of JonBenet Ramsey, 1996. A Christmas nightmare. A missing beauty queen, a bizarre ransom note, and a body in the basement. The tragic death of young JonBenet Ramsey was a multifaceted enigma that would defy explanation. 6-year-old beauty queen JonBenet Ramsey was destined for stardom. John and Patsy, her parents, were convinced of it. A former Miss West Virginia herself, Patsy Ramsey was determined that her pretty daughter should follow in her glamorous footsteps. In a cruel twist of fate, JonBenet would be buried in the same sparkly dress that she competed in. The tragic details of her death and the mysterious circumstances surrounding it make it one of America's most notorious unsolved child murder cases. An ideal home. From a very young age, JonBenet was entered into beauty pageants. Dressed in flashy outfits embellished with sequins or other eye-catching decoration, she would stand center stage and perform her well-practiced routine. The Sunburst National Pageant, Little Miss Colorado, Little Miss Charlevoix, Colorado State All-Star Kids Cover Girl and America's Royale. Miss JonBenet had competed in all of these beauty pageants and in many cases, won them. Just 2 weeks before she was brutally slain, she had been crowned Little Miss Christmas. The world remembers JonBenet with bleach blonde hair and a face full of makeup, but there was much more to this bright little girl. She excelled in mathematics and was fascinated by nature. She enjoyed following around the Ramsey's gardener, Brian Scott, while he worked. 1. I remember how intelligent JonBenet was. That's why I never talked to her as if she were just a little kid. Brian Scott. An ideal home. The Ramsey family's 6-year-old JonBenet, her 9-year-old brother Burke, and John and Patsy lived at 755 15th Street, Boulder, Colorado. Their home was an impressive brick house in the Tudor Revival style on a tree-lined avenue. John Ramsey was president of Access Graphics, a successful computer company, while Patsy was a former pageant star turned housewife. The Ramsey family seemed to epitomize the American dream. A beautiful family, an exquisite house, and a vacation home in picturesque Charlevoix, Michigan. As Christmas 1996 approached, the Ramseys sent out their usual greeting card detailing the things the family had done during the year, along with a festive photograph. This was the last card they would send as a family of four. On Christmas evening, the Ramsey family went to their old friends Fleet and Priscilla White's party, which they attended every year. The family left around 10 p.m. since they were traveling to their vacation home in Charlevoix the next morning and wanted to make an early start. According to John and Patsy, the whole family went straight to bed. Packing for the trip could wait until the morning. At around 5:45 a.m., Patsy Ramsey awoke and discovered a 3-page, handwritten note on the spiral staircase that led from the master bedroom to the kitchen. The spiral staircase that led from the master bedroom to the kitchen. Mr. Ramsey, listen carefully. We are a group of individuals that represent a small foreign faction. We do respect your business sick but not the country that it serves. At this time we have your daughter in our poses Zion sick. She is safe and unharmed, and if you want her to see 1997, you must follow our instructions to the letter. You will withdraw $118,000 from your account. $100,000 will be in $100 bills and the remaining $18,000 in $20 bills. Make sure that you bring an adequate size attaché to the bank. When you get home you will put the money in a brown paper bag. I will call you between 8 and 10 a.m. tomorrow to instruct you on delivery. The delivery will be exhausting, so I advise you to be rested. If we monitor you getting the money early, we might call you early to arrange an earlier delivery of the money and hence an earlier delivery pickup of your daughter. Any deviation of my instructions will result in the immediate execution of your daughter. You will also be denied her remains for proper burial. The two gentlemen watching over your daughter do not particularly like you, so I advise you not to provoke them. Speaking to anyone about your situation, such as police, FBI, etc., will result in your daughter being beheaded. If we catch you talking to a stray dog, she dies. If you alert bank authorities, she dies. If the money is in any way marked or tampered with, she dies. You will be scanned for electronic devices and if any are found, she dies. You can try to deceive us, but be warned that we are familiar with law enforcement countermeasures and tactics. You stand a 99% chance of killing your daughter if you try to outsmart us. Follow our instructions and you stand a 100% chance of getting her back. You and your family are under constant scrutiny as well as the authorities. Don't try to grow a brain, John. You are not the only fat cat around, so don't think that killing will be difficult. Don't underestimate us, John. Use that good southern common sense of yours. It is up to you now. John. Victory. S.B.T.C. After reading the note, Patsy rushed upstairs to find that JonBenet wasn't asleep where she should be. She wasn't in her bedroom. She wasn't in the bathroom. She was gone. Disregarding the conditions laid down in the threatening note, Patsy called 911. She then called several friends, including Fleet and Priscilla White, and begged them to come over immediately for moral support. 2. We have a kidnapping. Hurry. Please. Patsy Ramsey to 911 Operator Kim Arculita. Patsy Ramsey to 911 Operator Kim Arculita. The first officer on the scene, Rick French, was unable to find any sign of forced entry and noted that the house's security system had not been activated the night before. Contrary to normal protocol, the house was not cordoned off to preserve potential evidence. Police officers, the Ramseys, and their friends roamed freely around the place. At the designated time for the kidnapper to call, no phone call came. The White Door. At approximately 2 p.m., an officer told John and Fleet to conduct another search of the house. John took the lead and they headed toward the basement. Near the back was a small white door leading to a wine cellar, which had been ignored during the initial search, as Officer French had only been looking for exit or entry points to the house. Inside this cellar, John and Fleet found JonBenét's lifeless body. She was lying on her back with her arms raised above her head. A blanket was over her body and her mouth was sealed shut with duct tape. White cord was looped around her wrist and neck. Attached to the cord was a makeshift garrote constructed from a piece of a paintbrush. She had also received a blow to the head. As soon as he saw his daughter, John ripped the tape from her mouth, scooped her up in his arms, and rushed upstairs to the living room. Unfortunately, this act would prove extremely harmful to the investigation. The body should not have been touched, let alone moved, until a medical examiner had arrived on the scene. At this stage, the crime scene was severely compromised. An autopsy concluded that JonBenet had been asphyxiated. She had also suffered blunt force trauma to the head, leading to craniocerebral trauma. Although there was no evidence of conventional rape, sexual assault could not be ruled out. Undigested pineapple was found in her stomach, indicating that she had eaten the fruit within 2 hours of her death. Further investigation revealed the other half of the paintbrush among Patsy's art supplies in the basement. A family affair. On the kitchen table, investigators found a bowl of half-eaten pineapple. On the kitchen table, investigators found a bowl of half-eaten pineapple, as well as a heavy flashlight, though this was not thought important. The ransom note had been written using a pen and notepad that came from the kitchen. A rough draft of the note was also discovered. Whoever wrote it must have had detailed knowledge of the family's life. Moreover, he or she must have been able to move easily around the house in the dark and find the wine cellar in the basement. In the basement, a small window had been smashed. While this initially seemed suspicious, John said that he had broken it months earlier after accidentally locking himself out. On the windowsill was a layer of undisturbed dust and dirt as well as an intact spider web, suggesting that it was not an entry or exit point for an intruder. The length and language of the ransom note was highly revealing to some investigators, who felt that the handwriting looked similar to Patsy Ramsey's. The $118,000 figure that was demanded was the exact amount John Ramsey had received as a Christmas bonus, something that very few people could have known. Handwriting experts from the Colorado Bureau of Investigation decided that John Ramsey did not write the note, but their analysis regarding Patsy was inconclusive. Convinced that the police were regarding them as prime suspects in the murder of their daughter, both John and Patsy hired separate lawyers and refused to speak to investigators. They felt that they had told police everything they knew and could provide no more worthwhile insights into the case. April 30, 1997 / John and Patsy Ramsey finally agree to separate formal interviews at the Boulder County Justice. John and Patsy would only agree to an interview on condition that they received the police reports so that they could prepare for the questions. To the police, their reluctance to cooperate seemed to conflict with their earlier statements that they would do whatever was necessary to aid the investigation. Throughout her short life, JonBenet had a frequent tendency to wet the bed. For some, this cast further suspicion on John and Patsy, as bedwetting is often a response in children to abuse. The underwear that JonBenet was wearing when her body was found was stained with urine. And pull-up diapers were hanging out of the closet outside JonBenet's bedroom. A theory circulated that Patsy accidentally killed JonBenet in a fit of rage following a bedwetting accident, causing Patsy to scoff, "Does someone actually think I would kill my child because she wet the bed?" 3. One witness who appeared before a grand jury was Linda Hoffman-Pugh, the Ramseys' housekeeper at the time of JonBenet's murder. During the investigation, Linda voiced suspicions that Patsy was guilty of her daughter's murder, stating that she argued with her often. "I think she had multiple personalities. She'd be in a good mood and then she'd be cranky," she relayed in her statement. 4. Over the ensuing years, John and Patsy Ramsey remained under a cloud of suspicion. In 1999, the Boulder grand jury voted to indict both parents on 2 counts each of child abuse resulting in the death of JonBenet. However, the Ramseys were never indicted because the district attorney, Alex Hunter, refused to sign the documents. The brothers' behavior. Following questioning by a grand jury, authorities confirmed that Burke Ramsey, who was just 9 years old at the time of the murder, was not a suspect. However, JonBenet's brother became a favorite culprit among many internet sleuths over the years. His seemingly light-hearted, casual attitude during a taped interview with a child specialist on January 8, just 2 weeks after the death of his younger sister, caught the attention of several people. There was speculation that Burke had been violent with JonBenet in the past. According to a family photographer, he had hit her in the head with a golf club a year earlier. In December 2016, Burke's lawyers filed a defamation lawsuit totaling $750 million against CBS for speculating that he was the killer in their television documentary The Case of JonBenet Ramsey. In 2008, Boulder County DA Mary Lacey exonerated the entire Ramsey family on the basis that their DNA did not match unidentified male DNA found on 2 items of JonBenet's clothing. However, it transpired that the partial DNA profile that was obtained contained a mixture of DNA. The partial DNA profile that was obtained contained a mixture of DNA belonging to JonBenet, an unknown male, and, in one sample, a third unidentified person. Outsiders and intruders. Linda Hoffman-Pugh and her handyman husband, Mervyn, were also not safe from suspicion. Patsy told investigators that Linda had money problems and once asked the Ramseys for a loan. Moreover, Linda had a key to the house and was familiar with its layout. It was speculated that if JonBenet had been killed by an intruder or intruders, they could have had a key, since there was no obvious sign of forced entry. However, Linda and Mervyn were never formally accused of the crime. At the time of JonBenet's murder, Gary Oliva, a drifter with a history of sexually abusing minors, lived just a few blocks away from the Ramsey home, when he was picked up on an unrelated charge 4 years later. Police found a photograph of JonBenet and a stun gun in his backpack. A search of his apartment revealed an eerie shrine to JonBenet. Police took Oliva to the station to question him about the murder. He was grilled for hours, asked to provide DNA and writing samples, then released without charge. Someone who was convinced of Oliva's guilt was his own high school friend, Michael Vale, who claimed that just after JonBenet's murder, Oliva called him in a panic and said that he had hurt a little girl, before hanging up. In 2018, it was reported that Oliva sent a letter to Vale, confessing to the murder of JonBenet. An early suspect was Bill McReynolds, who played Santa Claus at private parties for the Ramseys. McReynolds and his wife, Janet, had been at the Ramsey home just 2 nights before JonBenet was murdered. The police were said to have discovered some eerie parallels between the McReynolds' lives and details in the murder case. On December 26, 1974, the McReynolds' 9-year-old daughter and another girl were abducted by an unknown assailant, who molested the second girl. Within hours, both girls were set free. Additionally, police found out that Janet had written a play in 1977 that was about the torture and murder of 16-year-old Sylvia Likens, who just so happened to be found dead in a basement, much like JonBenet. McReynolds staunchly denied any involvement, and investigators ruled him out. An electrician named Michael Helgath worked near the Ramsey home and had a history of violence and sexual abuse. In November 1996, Helgath supposedly told a colleague that he and a friend would soon make a large sum of money, $50,000 to $80,000 each. On February 13, 1997, Alex Hunter announced in a press conference that they were narrowing down the list of suspects, until only one would remain. 2 days later, Helgath was found dead by apparent suicide. In 2006, ex-schoolteacher John Mark Carr spun investigators a lurid tale of how he had drugged and sexually assaulted JonBenet before accidentally killing her. However, his confession conflicted with the evidence, as the autopsy revealed no drugs. Carr's DNA did not match any found on the body, and he was dropped as a suspect. An enduring mystery. The tragic case of JonBenet Ramsey divided the nation, with both the police and the public either believing that an intruder broke into the Ramsey home and killed JonBenet, or that she was murdered by a family member. Thanks to the combination of a contaminated crime scene, a bungled initial police investigation, and the diametrically opposed opinions of numerous experts, a definitive solution to the murder of JonBenet Ramsey seems as elusive as ever. Case notes. In December 1994, 2,000 people visited the Ramseys' home for a guided tour organized by the Boulder Historical Society. John Ramsey had 3 children from a previous marriage. In 1992, his eldest daughter, Elizabeth, died in a car crash aged 22. The length of the ransom note was highly unusual. Experts have claimed that the note could have been written after the murder. 73 suspects' handwriting was analyzed to discover who could have written the note. No one knows what the initials SBTC stand for. Several people were even reported to have cleaned the house as they attempted to keep themselves busy while waiting for news. A suitcase had been placed below a broken basement window. Marks on JonBenet's face could have been made by a stun gun or a piece of electric train track that belonged to Burke. A single, unidentified footprint was later found near the body, but none in the snow outside the window. Moving the body made it hard for police to determine cause of death. Patsy said that JonBenet had not eaten pineapple that day, and that she had gone straight to bed after the Whites' party. Both Patsy and Burke Ramsey's fingerprints were found on the bowl of pineapple. The Ramseys hired their own private investigator, Ellis Olmsted. The Ramseys offered a $50,000 reward for any information that could lead to the arrest of the killer. In March 1997, John Ramsey's 2 adult children, John Andrew and Melinda, were cleared as suspects. Some analyzed that JonBenet's incontinence was a protest against the pressure of the beauty pageants. Linda maintained that the blanket JonBenet's body had been wrapped in had most likely come from a clothes dryer near JonBenet's bedroom. Patsy Ramsey died of ovarian cancer on June 24, 2006, aged 49. Former friends and neighbors of the Ramseys stated that Burke had a temper and was jealous of the attention that his sister received. In a 2016 TV interview, Burke Ramsey said that the murderer was some pedophile in the pageant audience. A sample of male DNA on JonBenét's underwear could have potentially been transferred during the manufacturing process. It is possible that Linda would have known how much money John had been given as a Christmas bonus. Oliva claimed he never lusted over his JonBenét shrine, but instead would look at the pictures and cry. Gary Oliva is currently serving a prison sentence for 2 counts of attempted sexual exploitation of a child and 1 count of sexual exploitation of a child. Michael Helgath was the favorite suspect of the Ramseys' private investigator, Ollie Gray. Carr's ex-wife claimed that he had been with her in Alabama at the time of the murder. In 2016, it was announced that the DNA portion of the investigation would be reopened. 7th case. Tupac Shakur and Biggie Smalls, 1996-97. Drive-by shootings. Rap megastars Tupac Shakur and Biggie Smalls were friends who became the bitterest of rivals. Their deaths sparked the most infamous murder mystery in hip-hop history. Tupac Shakur and Biggie Smalls were 2 of the leading rap artists of the 1990s and remain among the most influential of all time. Their staggering fame and success was rapidly rising until both were killed in drive-by shootings. On September 7, 1996, Tupac Shakur, aged just 25, was gunned down in his car in Las Vegas and died from his wounds 6 days later. Just months later, on March 9 the following year, 24-year-old Christopher Wallace, better known as Biggie Smalls or the Notorious B.I.G., was shot dead in his car outside a Los Angeles party. The investigations that followed would reveal a grim insight into gang rivalries, greed for money, and dangerous grudges. Tupac and Biggie were key players in the East Coast-West Coast hip-hop rivalry. This was principally between the competing record labels. Bad Boy Records, owned by Sean Combs, aka Puff Daddy, and Death Row Records, owned by Marion Suge Knight. The feud sparked bitter tension between rappers, fans, and LA gangs, with the Crips backing Bad Boy Records and the Bloods backing Death Row Records. Tupac and Biggie had been friends early in their careers. However, in 1994 Shakur was ambushed and shot 5 times in Manhattan, and he accused Biggie of being involved in it. Some say it was this incident that launched the rift that would ultimately claim the lives of both artists. Following various accusations, Biggie responded by releasing songs with veiled references to the shooting, while Shakur released Hit 'Em Up, the lyrics of which bragged that he had slept with Biggie's wife, the singer and songwriter Faith Evans. The murder of Tupac. On September 7, 1996, Tupac attended the Mike Tyson vs. Bruce Seldon boxing match at the MGM Grand in Las Vegas. After they left, Suge Knight drove Shakur to a party at Club 662, with the rest of Tupac's entourage following in cars behind them. When Knight stopped at a traffic light, a white Cadillac pulled up alongside their black BMW, and more than a dozen shots were fired from a .40 Glock 22 semi-automatic pistol, mortally wounding Tupac and grazing Knight's head. Tupac had been hit twice in the chest, once in the arm, and once in the thigh. September 13, 1996 / Tupac Shakur dies from his injuries. The police investigation into Tupac's murder was plagued by a lack of evidence and fearful, uncooperative witnesses. Despite the fact that numerous people were nearby when the shooting occurred, apparently nobody saw a thing. a friend of Tupac's who had been there that night. Yaki Kadov said that he could identify the assailant. Unfortunately, he was accidentally shot dead just 2 months after Tupac, before the police were able to interview him about the case. The first person of interest in the shooting was a Southside Crips gang member named Orlando Anderson, who had been seen fighting with Tupac in the MGM Grand Lobby shortly before the shooting. Suge Knight's friend, Travon Lane, had identified Anderson as the person who had robbed him of his Death Row Records chain a few weeks earlier. Tupac and other members of Death Row Records promptly beat Anderson up when Tupac was ambushed in a drive-by shooting later that night. Anderson naturally became the prime suspect. He was arrested and questioned on October 2, 1996, but police released him without charge. 2 days later, the murder of Biggie. The music world reeled with grief following the shooting of Tupac, but it would not be long before fans were mourning another shocking murder. At around 12:35 a.m. on March 9, 1997, Biggie Smalls climbed into the passenger seat of his GMC Suburban. He was leaving a Soul Train Awards after-party hosted by Vibe magazine at the Peterson Automotive Museum in Los Angeles. As the car came to a halt at a red light, a dark green, or black, depending on the witness, Chevy pulled up alongside. At least 7 rounds from a 9mm pistol of unknown make were fired, though the door of Biggie's car and the closed tinted window, hitting only Biggie. It was clearly an assassination, with the killer having a specific target in mind. Biggie was rushed to nearby Cedars-Sinai Hospital, but was pronounced dead at 1:15 a.m. He had been hit by 4 bullets. The fatal shot struck his right hip, traveling up to his vital organs, including both his heart and his lungs. Death was almost instantaneous. Biggie had to be crazy to be so unprotected, in Los Angeles, 6 months after Tupac. LAPD officer. This professional drive-by hit mirrored the earlier slaying of Tupac. Shakur and the LAPD soon announced that, in their opinion, the murder was motivated by revenge. The conventional wisdom is, it's got to be payback for Tupac, an officer commented. Many rap aficionados agreed that the murders were a result of the long-running feud between the East Coast and West Coast, while others speculated that the feud could be a veil to hide a more complex motivation. The role of Suge Knight. Nick Broomfield's 2002 feature-length documentary, Biggie and Tupac, put forward the case that Suge Knight ordered Tupac's murder because Knight owed the rap star a large sum of money in royalties, and he had heard through the grapevine that Tupac was planning to switch to another record label. According to Broomfield, the murders of both Shakur and Biggie were orchestrated by Suge and then carried out and covered up by the LAPD. He alleged that, at the time of the murder, Knight had several LAPD officers on his payroll working as off-duty bodyguards. In the documentary, a former LAPD detective named Russell Poole reports that his own private investigation into Suge Knight's role in the murders of Tupac and Biggie was rebuffed. He believed that his superiors were engaged in a cover-up and resigned from his job. Randall Sullivan, author of Labyrinth 2, also presented a case against the Death Row Records boss. He claimed that Knight had Biggie murdered to maintain the illusion of a tit-for-tat feud and divert suspicion from himself for Tupac's murder. If this had been some ordinary drive-by shooting by some inexperienced gangbangers, we would have solved it a long time ago. Former LAPD detective Russell Poole. In 2005, Biggie's family filed a wrongful death lawsuit in which they contended that ex-LAPD officer, David Mack, helped to plan Biggie's shooting. Mack, who by then was serving a 14-year prison sentence for bank robbery, denied any involvement. Kevin Hackey, Tupac's former bodyguard, was called as a witness. He testified that Mack and employees of Death Row Records including Suge Knight orchestrated the murder. He stated that he once heard Death Row Records head of the murder. He stated that he once heard Death Row Records head of security and LAPD officer Reggie Wright Jr. say that they were going to get Biggie in retaliation for Tupac's murder. However, the wrongful death lawsuit was dismissed. Biggie's crime? Another widely popular theory is that it was in fact Biggie Smalls who ordered the hit on Tupac Shakur during the escalating East Coast vs. West Coast feud. Los Angeles Times reporter Chuck Phillips wrote an article in which he claimed that Biggie was in Las Vegas at the time of the shooting and that he supplied the gun and a $1 million bounty for the murder of Tupac, which was carried out by the Crips in revenge for the beating of Orlando Anderson. However, further investigation revealed that Biggie was in a New York recording studio at the time of the murder. Phillips would later write another report in which he alleged that Biggie was involved in an earlier shooting of Shakur in New York in 1994. This report claimed that Biggie along with Sean Combs and Czar Entertainment CEO Jimmy Henchman Rosemond orchestrated the attack in response to perceived disrespect by Tupac. Both Combs and Rosemond strongly denied any involvement, saying that the story is beyond ridiculous and is completely false. They added that they had never even been questioned in regard to the shooting. 3. Phillips had supposedly received the information from jailhouse informants, and in 2011, Dexter Isaac, who was serving time in prison for unrelated crimes, claimed that he had committed the 1994 shooting of Tupac Shakur and that Rosemond had paid him $2,500 to carry it out. A matter of debt. The conspiracy theories and stream of suspects surrounding the two murder cases are seemingly endless. Retired LAPD homicide detective Greg Kading, who worked on both cases, provided yet another theory. In his 2011 book Murder Rap, The Untold Story of the Biggie Smalls and Tupac Shakur Murders by the detective who solved both cases. 4. Kading maintains that Sean Combs hired Tupac's assassin for $1 million. Furthermore, sources in a 1998 Vice article alleged that Biggie was killed over unpaid debts of $100,000 owed to the Crips, who had been hired as security by Combs. Puffy refused to pay the $100,000. He offered them $10,000. That's why Biggie Smalls is dead today, said Reggie Wright Jr., who would later be named as a suspect in the murder of Tupac Shakur by both Suge Knight and then Kevin Hackey. During the wrongful death lawsuit filed by Biggie's family, Combs responded, "That's not even possible. I don't have debts, period. Gone but not forgotten." The forever intertwined murders gave an insight into hip-hop's murky underworld. The short lives and violent deaths of Tupac Shakur and Biggie Smalls have made them international icons. Few pop culture figures have been mythologized and eulogized to the same extent. Spectacular murals paying tribute to both rap artists adorn streets worldwide. Nevertheless, despite all the many articles, books, movies, and theories devoted to the double murder, nobody has ever been charged with either killing. As long as the key players remain tight-lipped, there is little hope of closure anytime soon. Case notes. Nobody was ever charged for the 1994 shooting of Tupac. Tupac Shakur came from a political background. His mother, Afeni, was a member of the radical Black Panther Party. 15 minutes before the shooting, Knight was stopped by Metro Patrol cops for playing the car stereo too loudly and for not having license plates. He was not cited, and was released. A Death Row Records chain was worn by members of the label. Orlando Anderson died in a gang shooting unrelated to the Tupac case in 1998. Biggie closed his second album, Life After Death, with the track, You're Nobody, Till Somebody Kills You. He was shot dead just weeks before its release. Biggie had ordered a new, bulletproof Chevrolet Suburban. He was killed 3 days before it arrived. According to witnesses, the driver of the car the shots came from was wearing a blue suit and bow tie. Broomfield also alleged that Suge Knight had Tupac killed in order to sell more posthumous albums. In October 2018, Suge Knight was sentenced to 28 years for the hit-and-run murder in 2015 of former rap music label owner Terry Carter. There were rumors that Tupac had faked his own death. These were fueled by the flood of new songs released following his murder, as well as his posthumous appearances in music videos. On the night of Biggie's death, his car had been following Sean Combs' car, but only Biggie's was stopped at the traffic light. In 2018, rapper Keith D. Dwayne Keith Davis, claimed in a deathbed confession to have been involved in the Tupac shooting. 8th case. The murder of Jill Dando, 1999. Shot in broad daylight. The brutal murder of television presenter Jill Dando, killed on the doorstep of her London home, was not only headline news because of her celebrity, it truly shocked Britain. Jill Dando was a hugely popular BBC TV presenter throughout the 1990s. Her charming personality and warm presence lit up such programs as Breakfast News, The 6 O'Clock News, and the travel series Holiday. However, Jill was best known as one of the principal anchors of the primetime investigative show Crime Watch. Each week, Jill would present the key facts of a recent, unsolved UK crime and invite viewers to help police by contacting a special phone number. Crime Watch was partly responsible for bringing a number of criminals to justice. Just 37 years old, Jill was in the prime of her life and career, and soon to be married to gynecologist Alan Farthing. Alan lived in Bedford Close in the affluent district of Chiswick, West London. Jill was in the process of selling her 2-story home at 29 Gowan Avenue in nearby Fulham so that she could move in with her fiancé. Her own home was up for sale, but she still needed to stop off there to pick up mail and check her fax machine. On the morning of April 26, 1999, Jill Dando set off to make just such a visit. On the way, she went into a BP gas station store, bought a new fax machine cartridge and paper, and 2 fillets of Dover sole. Her image was captured on security cameras at the gas station, and there was no evidence that she was being followed. Jill was scheduled to read the BBC 6 o'clock news the following day. In a tragic twist of fate, her own murder would be the lead story. Final moments. At approximately 11:30 a.m., Jill arrived at her front door. She was carrying a shopping bag in one hand and her house keys in the other. Before she had a chance to open the door, she was seized, pushed to the ground, and shot once in the head. Jill's neighbor, Richard Hughes, later told police that around the time of the attack, he heard her let out a very distinctive scream, adding that she sounded quite surprised. 1 moment later, he spotted a clean-shaven, well-dressed man with dark hair running down the street. He estimated that the man was in his late 30s or early 40s and was about 5 feet 11 inches, 1.8 meters, tall. Unaware that anything was awry, Hughes continued with his day. 15 minutes later, a woman passing by discovered Jill lying on the ground outside her home in a pool of blood, her head resting against her front door. She was rushed to Charing Cross Hospital, but was pronounced dead on arrival. The autopsy revealed that the gun had been pressed hard against Jill's head when it was fired. The impression of the weapon's barrel and sight was clearly visible. A single 9mm bullet had entered just behind the top of her left ear and exited above the right ear, embedding itself in the front door. The gun had not been fitted with a silencer, but, because it was fired while forced against Jill's head, the noise of the shot would have been greatly reduced. Damage to the lower part of the door indicated that the victim had been in a crouched position when the fatal shot was fired, presumably forced to the ground by her killer. A bruise on Jill's forearm could have been caused by her assailant. Police investigators, some of whom had worked alongside Jill on Crime Watch, now had the grim task of trying to identify and catch her killer. Speculation immediately focused on the motive for the murder. As an investigative journalist and presenter, Jill had come into contact with a number of unsavory characters over the course of her career. Could she have been targeted by a professional hitman? Was someone seeking revenge? One theory was that she had been murdered by a Yugoslavian or Serbian assassin after making a TV appeal for Kosovo Albanian refugees, who had been driven from their homes by militias backing Serbian leader Slobodan Milosevic. Another theory was that she had been targeted by a criminal she had helped to expose on an episode of Crime Watch. The fact that the killer knew to place the gun directly against her head to minimize noise and blood spatter indicated that he or she could have been a professional. Another early line of inquiry examined the possibility that Jill had been murdered by an obsessive stalker, an occupational hazard for those in the limelight. It could either be a stalker or a hitman. However, there are many theories to be explored and nothing will be left untouched, announced Detective Chief Inspector Hamish Campbell, who was leading the investigation. May 25, 2000 Police arrest local man Barry George for the murder of Jill Dando. Massive media coverage meant that the police were under great pressure to find the killer. Nevertheless, their inquiries proved fruitless. Until, more than a year later, came the announcement the press and public had waited for: Barry George, 39, described as a local weirdo with an obsession for Freddie Mercury of the rock band Queen, was charged with Jill Dando's murder. George had come to the attention of the police when he called them shortly after Jill's death to report that he had seen a truck acting suspiciously near her home on the day of the murder. Police discovered that George, who was unemployed, had a history of stalking women and also convictions for sexual assault. He was put under surveillance as police collected evidence against him. After his arrest, much was made of George's local reputation as a loner and an oddball. He certainly had obsessive aspects to his personality. He had an unusual interest in celebrities and frequently adopted their names. In the years leading up to his arrest, he had called himself Steve Majors, after stuntman Lee Majors, who played Col. Steve Austin in the TV action series The $6 Million Man, as well as Barry Bulsara, Freddie Mercury's real surname. George also fabricated stories about his past, claiming to have been a roadie for Michael Jackson and to have served in the British Army's elite SAS Corps. Those who knew him said that he was obsessed with his health and could frequently be seen jogging or biking in the neighborhood. Shortly before his trial, George, who had an IQ of just 75, placing him in the lowest 5% of the population was diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome. Just a fan? During Barry George's trial, the prosecution stressed the fact that when his apartment in nearby Crookham Road was searched, they discovered 54 newspaper clippings dating back to 1990 about Jill. However, Barry's lawyer, Michael Mansfield QC, pointed out that George also had a number of newspaper clippings concerning other celebrities. In fact, the articles about Jill represented only 8% of the clippings found in his apartment. There would be no way of telling from the 670 newspapers found there whether he was more interested in Manchester United than Jill Dando, would there? 5. He said, in response to the prosecution's claim that George was an obsessive fan. The fundamental flaw in this argument is that there is no evidence, none at all, that, prior to Jill Dando's murder, this defendant had any exaggerated, special, or particular interest in her, Mansfield observed. 6. He emphasized that when Barry's apartment was searched, no personal photographs or videos of Jill were found, and neither were any autographs. If George was obsessed with Jill, as the prosecution claimed, then he would surely have gone to her house, which was just a short distance from his own, to take photographs of her, or at least attempt to ask her for her autograph. A witness at the trial claimed to have seen George outside Dando's house several hours before the murder. However, the only piece of concrete evidence that could conceivably tie George to the crime was a tiny trace of a substance, reported to be firearm residue, found in the pocket of his jacket. A polyester fiber found on Jill Dando's coat could have come from George's pants, but the fiber was too common and too small for forensics expert Jeffrey Rowe to be sure. Mansfield went on to claim that the murder could have been a Serbian death squad reprisal for the RAF's bombing of a Belgrade TV station. He also produced an official report that stated that a Serbian warlord had put the BBC Director General, Sir John Bird, on a hit list. He suggested to the court that the target may have changed to Jill Dando after security was allegedly stepped up to protect Bird. July 2, 2001 / Barry George is found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. Despite the flimsy and highly circumstantial evidence against him, Barry George was found guilty. An appeal against the conviction was turned down the following year. Doggedly protesting his innocence, George took the case to the Criminal Cases Review Commission. Forensic science experts now questioned whether the particle found in George's jacket was firearm residue after all. They decided that it was, in fact, no more likely that the particle had come from a gun fired by George than that it had come from some other source. A retrial was scheduled, and the firearm evidence so crucial to George's original conviction was dismissed by the judge. August 1, 2008 / Barry George is acquitted of Jill Dando's murder after serving 7 years in prison. Following Barry George's acquittal, there was widespread criticism in the media that the police had focused all their attention on trying to prove George's guilt and devoted insufficient time to investigating other potential suspects. According to reports released in 2015, over 100 possible suspects in the murder were never successfully traced by police. These documents showed that some of these individuals included members of the Serbian Secret Service and of the IRA, as well as a notorious British gangster based in Spain. Furthermore, 11 men spotted on Jill's street that afternoon were never identified. I find it disturbing. There were 100 suspects who were never followed up. To put Barry. There were 100 suspects who were never followed up. To put Barry George in the frame, they had to exclude everyone else, said Michael Mansfield. This was a professional hit. Michael Mansfield, QC. After this information came to light, Alice Beers, a BBC colleague of Jill Dando and a former presenter of the Watchdog Consumer Advice program, came forward to report that Jill had received threatening letters just weeks before she was killed. She said that both she and Jill had received letters from somebody threatening to kidnap and rape them. She expected the police to contact her about the letters, but no call ever came. If no stone was left unturned, then I would have been called, she said. Copycat killing. Was Jill Dando's murderer an obsessive fan, a vengeful gangster, or a Serbian hitman? In 2009, the BBC revealed that shortly after Jill's murder, an anonymous caller claiming to have killed Jill Dando had also threatened the head of BBC News at the time, Tony Hall. In 2012, the Serbian angle seemed to become more plausible when the Daily Mail newspaper reported that a Serbian woman, Branka Pirpa, claimed that her TV presenter husband, Slavko Kurovija, a critic of Slobodan Milosevic, had been murdered in a similar fashion. Despite intense media coverage in the press and on television, and a hefty reward for information leading to a conviction, Jill Dando's killer has never been brought to justice. Case notes. Jill Dando was voted BBC Personality of the Year in 1997. Jill Dando's appeal on behalf of Kosovan Albanian refugees occurred on April 6, 1999, just 20 days before her murder. Detectives allegedly assigned an undercover policewoman to talk to George, hoping he would confess to the murder, but without success. 4. George began calling himself Barry Bulsara after Freddie Mercury's death in 1991. George claimed to be Freddie Mercury's cousin and pestered women who worked for Queen's fan club. In 1983, George W.A. arrested in the grounds of Kensington Palace. He was wearing a balaclava and carrying a knife and rope. A witness reported seeing a man matching a police e-fit photograph leaving Jill Dando's street shortly after the murder. Slavko Kurovija was murdered just 15 days before Jill Dando. 9th case. The murder of Kathleen Peterson, 2001. Staircase of death. A brutal murder? A tragic accident? A bizarre bird strike? The mysterious fate of successful businesswoman Kathleen Peterson whipped up a storm of bitter controversy and wild theorizing that has never abated. To the outside world, the Petersons had everything: a beautiful home, a loving marriage, and successful careers. Kathleen Peterson earned a six-figure salary with a telecommunications company. Her husband, Michael, was a full-time novelist. This idyllic image was shattered when, in December 2001, Kathleen was found dead at the bottom of a now infamous staircase in the couple's North Carolina home. The investigation that followed uncovered lies, adultery and financial woes, and another death at the bottom of a different staircase. It all led to Michael's eventual conviction, but some believe there's an altogether different explanation for Kathleen's death. Kathleen, 48, and Michael, 58, had both been married before when they met in the mid-1980s. Their meeting was facilitated by their children, who were friends. Kathleen had a teenage daughter named Caitlin. Michael had two sons, Clayton and Todd, from his first marriage, as well as two adopted daughters, named Margaret and Martha. In 1992, this Brady Bunch-style family moved into a sprawling home on Cedar Street in Durham, North Carolina. 5 years later, Michael and Kathleen exchanged vows, making their union official. Caitlin described them as the most ideal parents. After moving into the Cedar Street home, Michael started writing columns on city politics for the local newspaper, the Herald Sun. His increased public profile prompted him to run for mayor, a bid that ended badly following revelations that he had exaggerated his military record. He had claimed he was awarded a Purple Heart after being wounded by shrapnel in Vietnam. In reality, he was awarded the medal after he had been hurt in a car accident. Despite this embarrassment, Michael still hoped to enter the political arena. In 2001, a few months before Kathleen's death, he ran for city council, but again, lost. When officials moved so quickly to charge him with his wife's murder, he wondered if local politics had something to do with it. A desperate husband. In the early hours of December 9, 2001, Michael frantically called 911. "My wife had an accident. She's still breathing," he cried. "She fell down the stairs. She's still breathing, please come." 2 police and medics arrived, but the scene was not as they expected. Michael had said he spent 3 hours by the pool that night. Yet, although the temperature outside was only around 55 degrees Fahrenheit, 12.7 degrees Celsius, all he was wearing were shorts and a t-shirt. Kathleen was lying in a pool of blood at the foot of the stairs. Blood spatter climbed the walls and reached the ceiling. Then came the autopsy findings. Kathleen's head had been sliced open in places. The medical examiner determined that she had died as the result of a beating, not a fall down the stairs. December 11, 2001 / Michael Peterson is charged with his wife Kathleen's murder. Michael insisted he was innocent. He said that he and Kathleen had been drinking, and that she had also taken a Valium. He could only surmise that the combination of the drug with alcohol made her unsteady on her flip-flop clad feet, causing her to tumble down the wooden staircase. "I've whispered her name more than 1,000 times, and I can't stop crying. I would have never done anything to hurt her," Michael told reporters outside the Durham County Jail. 3. Prosecutors didn't buy it. While they did find alcohol in Kathleen's system, the blood alcohol content was only 0.07% below the legal limit to drive in North Carolina. Investigators learned that she had suffered from headaches and dizziness for weeks before her fall and had even lost her vision for a half hour at one point. Nevertheless, they claimed to have found too much evidence that pointed to Michael as the culprit, including another dead body. Look to the past. 16 years before Kathleen was found dead, a 43-year-old woman named Elizabeth Ratliff died in similar fashion. Ratliff was an American working as a teacher at an airbase near Frankfurt, Germany. She was also a friend of Michael's, who lived in Germany for a spell with his first wife and 2 sons. On November 25, 1985, Ratliff died after falling down the stairs. As in Kathleen's case, there was a lot of blood at the scene. "The blood was all the way up the staircase," said her friend, Cheryl Appel Schumacher, who later helped to clean up. For the authorities had accepted that the death was an accident and that Elizabeth had suffered a brain hemorrhage while climbing the stairs. Michael helped to organize Elizabeth's funeral and subsequently adopted her daughters. When North Carolina prosecutors heard of Michael's proximity to another staircase-related death, they announced that the similarities were too many to be coincidental. "Here I have 2 cases. 2 women that appeared to die the same way. 2 women that are associated with Michael Peterson. Lightning don't strike the same place twice," Detective Art Holland told a television reporter. 5. Elizabeth's body was exhumed in Texas, and a medical examiner from North Carolina performed a new autopsy. Her verdict: Elizabeth had been beaten to death and the German authorities had overlooked the evidence. Jim Harden, the district attorney who prosecuted Peterson, did a great deal of research into the suspect, a lot of which was severely damning. The couple had $143,000 in credit card debt, nearly equal Kathleen's annual salary. In addition, Kathleen was insured for $1.40 million, which Michael would pocket if her death were accidental. 6. Harden presented a compelling argument that this sum would solve Michael's financial problems and allow him to continue to live the affluent, privileged life to which he had been accustomed. 7. From what we've found, every aspect of Mike Peterson's life is a lie. Jim Harden. However, there was another revelation that prosecutors proffered as the most likely murder motive. Michael had been emailing men to solicit sex and had a cache of gay pornography on his computer. Michael had been emailing a man named Brent Walgamot for sex. Walgamot testified that he had exchanged about 20 emails with Michael and talked to him on the phone between August 30th and September 5th, 2001. He had planned to meet Michael for a rendezvous, but he stood Michael up and never heard from him again. Walgamot testified that Michael made it clear he was committed to his wife. If it's an idyllic relationship in this marriage, why is he emailing somebody else to meet for sexual relations outside of marriage? Asked Assistant District Attorney David Sox. 9. He suggested that Kathleen could have found the pornographic photos or the sex-soliciting emails on Michael's computer and confronted him, which would have been a clear motive for Michael to murder her. Blood and the blowpoke. Harden pointed to the abundance of blood at the scene as proof Michael was lying about Kathleen's fate. During the 2003 trial, the prosecutor called to testify Dwayne Deaver, a State Bureau of Identification, SBI agent deemed by Judge Orlando Hudson to be an expert in blood spatter evidence. Deaver told jurors that he had conducted a series of experiments that pointed away from Kathleen having accidentally fallen and toward a beating. Michael's lawyers presented their own blood spatter expert, Dr. Henry Lee asserted that the blood in the stairwell was, in fact, consistent with a fall. Once Kathleen hit her head, she could have coughed up blood while dazed and staggering. Lee went even further by insisting the amount of blood precluded a beating. No murder weapon was found at the scene, but prosecutors offered one anyway. Kathleen's sister Candace had given her a fireplace poke as a Christmas gift in 1984. According to pathologist Dr. Deborah Radis, the 40-inch, 101.6 centimeters, brass tool was the perfect instrument for inflicting the lacerations found on Kathleen's scalp. The blowpoke was found covered with dead bugs and cobwebs in a garage during the trial. Harden questioned a detective who had searched the garage, subtly suggesting that the blowpoke had been planted there. The fight goes on. On October 10, 2003, jurors sided with the prosecution. Michael was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His adopted daughters, whose mother's death had been used to prove Michael's guilt, sobbed in the courtroom, certain of his innocence. Kathleen's family, including her daughter Caitlin, who had split with her siblings by marriage in believing Michael guilty, applauded the conviction. Michael's lawyers kept fighting. Throughout the investigation, they had cooperated with a film crew who produced The Staircase, a groundbreaking French television documentary that generated worldwide interest in Michael's case. 2 days after the conviction, they started the appeal process, arguing that evidence connected with Elizabeth's death never should have been admitted. They challenged Dever's testimony and qualifications, arguing that he had exaggerated his credentials during the trial. Their objections fell on deaf ears until 2011, when the agent was fired from the SBI for failing to report blood test results that helped lead to the wrongful murder conviction of an innocent man named Greg Taylor, who spent almost 17 years in prison. Paulette Sutton, a nationally recognized expert in blood pattern analysis, testified that Dever's methods were antiquated and unscientific. According to an Associated Press story, she chuckled as she watched videos of Dever beating a styrofoam head and blood-soaked sponge in an attempt to recreate the blood splatters found on Peterson's shoes and in the stairwell. Sutton's testimony helped overturn Michael's conviction, and in 2011, Judge Hudson ruled that Dever had misled jurors and that Michael would get a new trial. Michael spent 8 years in prison proclaiming his innocence, but prosecutors still insisted on his guilt. In 2017, facing the prospect of a trial at 73 years old, Michael entered an Alford plea to a manslaughter charge. The plea is treated as a guilty plea for sentencing purposes, but Michael received less than the 8 years he had already served. This meant he could walk away a free man. Michael said that taking the Alford plea was the most difficult thing he had ever done, but he believed police and prosecutors would do anything to convict me. And I am not going to put my life and my freedom in their hands. 10 prosecutors considered the plea a win. Durham District Attorney Roger Eccles stated, "It has always been, and remains today, the state's position that Michael Peterson is responsible for the death of Kathleen Peterson." Owl attack. The Staircase documentary unwittingly recruited armchair detectives worldwide to proffer theories explaining what could have happened to Kathleen that night. Most are split between the two scenarios presented at trial, that either Michael killed his wife, or she fell in a manner that caused multiple injuries to her head. However, the most intriguing theory suggests the case is more a whodunit than a whodunit. In 2003, Larry Pollard, a friend of Michael's, asked prosecutors to reopen the case because of information that pointed to another culprit altogether, an owl. Looking at autopsy photos, Pollard said that some of the gashes on Kathleen's body looked like marks from an owl's exceptionally sharp talons. Pollard consulted with ornithological experts who agreed that the pattern and shape of the cuts on Kathleen's head looked far more like an owl attack than a fireplace tool. Hardin dismissed this theory as being completely ridiculous, but owl attacks are not as outlandish as they might seem. Kate Davis, executive director of a wild bird education organization in Florence, Italy, said, "Raptors are known to get aggressive when defending their nests and hatchlings. They tend to attack at night." Michael's phone call to 911 was at 2:40 a.m. Kathleen was holding clumps of her own hair, mixed with wood splinters and needles from a cedar tree. Could an owl have become entangled in her hair? When the SBI eventually acknowledged finding a microscopic feather on a clump of hair in Kathleen's hand, Pollard shouted, "The feather has been found." With Michael's plea agreement, however, the owl theory will never have its day in court. Michael himself said he has run out of theories. "The only thing I know absolutely, positively, is that I had nothing to do with Kathleen's death." Case notes. The Petersons' house was 10,000 square foot, 3,048 square m, had 14 rooms, and was white with black shutters. The Purple Heart is a decoration reserved for military personnel injured or killed in action. There appeared to be a shoe print in blood on the back of Kathleen's sweatshirt. Michael was barefoot when police arrived. His sneakers and socks were found next to Kathleen's body. There was a drop of blood on the inside of Michael's shorts. Kathleen was wearing sweatpants and a sweatshirt, appropriate clothing for the outside temperature. Michael said that he and Kathleen had been drinking champagne to celebrate a possible movie deal for one of his novels. Michael claimed to have been relaxing by the pool, too far away to hear any screams from the house. The prosecution suggested that the death of his friend Elizabeth Ratliff had given Michael the idea of how to murder his own wife and get away with it. Kathleen had confided in her sister, Candace, that her company's stock was in free fall, and that she had lost $1 million on paper. Walgamot said he charged men $1.50 an hour to do anything under the sun. 8. State computer experts determined that someone had deleted hundreds of gay pornography files in the days leading up to Kathleen's death and the day after she died. Dr. Henry Lee had been the medical examiner in the infamous O.J. Simpson case. Dr. Lee theorized that Kathleen's coughs could have propelled blood spatter up the stairwell walls. Forensic tests ruled out the blow poke as the murder weapon. No other murder weapon has been suggested. Caitlin and her father were awarded the $1.4 million life insurance policy for which Michael had been the beneficiary. The documentary series The Staircase was directed by Oscar winner Jean-Xavier de Lestrade. It won a prestigious Peabody Award in 2005. An audit found that, over Deaver's 25-year career, he had falsified evidence in 34 separate cases. The Alford plea allowed Michael to maintain his innocence while acknowledging that there was enough evidence to convict him of the charge. Some thought that Kathleen may have interrupted an intruder, who pummeled her before fleeing. The species of owl put forward as Kathleen's potential attacker is a barred owl. An adult weighs 1.6 pounds, 725 g, with a wingspan up to 44 inches, 112 centimeters. Kathleen may have been attacked by the owl outside and then staggered in and collapsed at the foot of the stairs. In 2007, Caitlin and Michael reached a $25 million settlement in a wrongful death suit. Caitlin said this ensured that Michael couldn't write a book about the case and pocket the profit. 10th CAE. Long Island serial killer, C.1996, 2010. Lost in the marshland. The woman was terrified, seemingly running for her life. Soon after she vanished into the night, a peaceful area of rural Long Island began to yield up its terrible secrets. Ents marshland runs alongside Long Island's Ocean Parkway, a beautiful albeit desolate stretch of beach highway. It was here, hidden away from the eyes of passing drivers, that a serial killer disposed of his victims. Over the course of almost 20 years, the Long Island serial killer, or the Gilgo Beach Killer, as he was also known, murdered between 10 and 16 people associated with prostitution. The identity of the killer and his motives have perplexed homicide detectives ever since the first discovery of his victims in December 2010, and has led to one of the most infamous, unidentified serial killer cases in recent history. This grim story unfolded on May 1st of that year, when Shannon Gilbert, a 24-year-old Craigslist escort from New Jersey, vanished. Before her disappearance, Shannon had visited the home of Joseph Brewer, a resident of the upmarket gated community of Oak Beach, who had hired Shannon as his escort for the evening. Brewer would later tell police that, after arriving at his home, Shannon began to act erratically and appeared disoriented before fleeing out into the warm night. She ran straight past her pimp, Michael Pack, who was waiting for her outside in his black Ford Explorer. Several neighbors saw and heard Shannon. That night, she ran down the street of expensive houses, pounding on doors and screaming for help. Despite her evident distress, nobody let her in. Instead, they called 911 and watched as she ran away from the Oak Beach gatehouse toward Anchor Way and then onto the bayou, completely out of sight. Exactly who Shannon was running from remains a mystery. At some point during her escape, she managed to call 911 and hollered, "They're trying to kill me." The lost women. 7 months after Shannon disappeared, 4 bodies were found close to one another, nestled among the thorny underbrush running alongside Ocean Parkway on Gilgo Beach. As news of this gruesome find circulated in the media, locals and investigators presumed that one of the bodies would be Shannon Gilbert, as the site was just 3 miles, 4.8 kilometers, from where she was last seen. However, an examination of the remains concluded that none of them was her. They were identified as Amber Lynn Costello, 27, Melissa Barthelemy, 24, Maureen Brainerd Barnes, 25, and Megan Waterman, 22. Just like Shannon, all 4 women had been working as Craigslist escorts when they disappeared. Maureen went missing in July 2007 when she left Norwich, Connecticut for New York City. Melissa vanished in July 2009 after meeting with an escort client. Megan disappeared just a month after Gilbert, having placed a Craigslist advertisement, and Amber vanished in September 2010, after arranging to meet a client who offered her $1,500 for her services. It became clear that these discoveries had unearthed a serial killer's dumping ground and, in April 2011, an extensive search was finally launched. Airplanes fitted with high-tech photographic equipment scoured the area, while police with horses and dogs explored the undergrowth alongside the highway and beach. The search led to the discovery of 6 more victims approximately 1 mile, 1.6 kilometers, east of the other bodies, 4 more women, a female toddler and an Asian man wearing women's clothing. Of these victims, which were all found within 2 miles, 3.2 kilometers, of the first cluster of bodies, only one has ever been identified, 20-year-old Jessica Taylor. She vanished in July 2003, while working as an escort in Manhattan, New York. Shortly after her disappearance, her dismembered torso had been found in Manorville, New York, around 40 miles, 64.4 kilometers, east of Gilgo Beach. Her skull, hands, and a forearm were subsequently discovered during the search of Gilgo Beach itself. The remains of another victim, known only as Jane Doe 06, were also found at Manorville and Gilgo Beach. While the police were unable to identify the remains, forensic experts did determine that none belonged to Shannon Gilbert. What happened to Shannon? In early December 2011, an extended search turned up Shannon Gilbert's purse, cell phone, lip gloss, jeans, and shoes in a marsh near Oak Beach, several miles to the east of the second group of bodies. Following the discovery, the search for Shannon intensified, with the outcome looking decidedly bleak. Dozens of officers using machetes and a bulldozer were called to the scene. December 13, 2011. The remains of Shannon Gilbert are found in a shallow marsh near Oak Beach, the place where she was last seen alive. The authorities soon announced that they believed Gilbert had drowned in the marsh and that her death was not connected to the other murders, despite the fact that she was found in the same vicinity and fit the victim Profile. Her family was furious with this conclusion and lambasted this premature and inconsiderate theory. 2. In fact, before Gilbert's body was even found, Suffolk County Police Commissioner Richard Dormer publicly announced that he believed Gilbert had wandered off and accidentally drowned. "I think Dormer just wants to find the remains, say she drowned, and close the case before he retires," fumed Mari Gilbert, Shannon's mother. The investigation also drew criticism from some of the victims' families, who accused officers of incompetence and inaction. Some even hired their own private investigators. Shannon's family hired Michael Baden, a forensic pathologist, in order to obtain a second opinion on her autopsy. According to Baden, there was no evidence that Shannon had died of natural causes, a drug overdose, or, as Suffolk County Police believed, by drowning. He observed that there was insufficient information to determine a definite cause of death, but found that the hyoid bone in Shannon's neck was deformed, which could have been caused by strangulation. 3. These structures, the larynx. These structures, the larynx and the hyoid bone, are often fractured during homicidal manual strangulation. Michael Baden. Since the discovery of the bodies, plenty of theories have abounded. Some have speculated that the killer was a seasonal worker, a drifter, or a fisherman from Freeport. More lurid theories have also been put forward that the killer was making snuff films or belonged to a satanic cult. Another hypothesis involved a local businessman who committed suicide days after Shannon's remains were found. Police were quick to deny that he was a suspect. He was merely a victim of rumors and hearsay. Untraceable calls. One of the more likely theories was that the killer was a police officer or ex-police officer with extensive knowledge of law enforcement techniques. Following Melissa Barthelomy's disappearance, the Long Island serial killer made taunting phone calls to her 16-year-old sister, Amanda. He called Melissa a whore and asked if Amanda knew what Melissa was doing. These calls were always placed from crowded areas, such as New York's Penn Station and Madison Square Garden, where it would have been next to impossible for surveillance cameras to single out the caller from the crowd. Moreover, the caller only stayed on the line for under 3 minutes, indicating that he knew it took from 3 to 5 minutes to successfully trace a phone call. Police were convinced that these calls came from the killer, as opposed to a prankster, leading many to believe that the murderer must have been a member of a law enforcement agency at some point in his life. Amid the investigation into the murders, Suffolk County Police Chief James Burke resigned, adding fuel to the rogue cop theory. Following his James Burke resigned, adding fuel to the rogue cop theory. Following his resignation, Burke was arrested for a 2012 assault on Christopher Loeb, who had stolen a duffel bag filled with pornography and sex toys from Burke's car. After Burke's arrest, an escort came forward to claim that he was into rough sex. She alleged that Burke had attempted to strangle her during a party in Oak Beach, the gated community where Gilbert was last seen alive. It then transpired that Burke had stymied an FBI investigation into the Long Island murders and had intentionally kept them out of the loop. What was he afraid of the FBI finding? In 2016, an attorney for Shannon Gilbert's family alleged that there could be a connection between Burke and the murders. However, he was never charged. The lying doctor. Another suspect in the slayings was Dr. Peter Hackett, a physician and neighbor of Joseph Brewer, one of the last people to see Shannon alive. Dr. Hackett lived in close proximity to the marshland where Shannon Gilbert's remains would later be found. According to Shannon's mother, Mari Gilbert, Dr. Hackett had called her the day after her daughter went missing and told her that he was a doctor who ran a home for wayward girls. Several days later, Dr. Hackett denied he had ever made this call. Phone records, however, confirmed that he had called Mari Gilbert twice following Shannon's disappearance. In 2012, Shannon's family filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Dr. Hackett, in which they alleged that he could have prevented her death. Dr. Hackett told Mari Gilbert that he ran a home for wayward girls, and that Shannon was in his care, said John Ray, an attorney for the Gilbert family. Why would anyone do something like that? For Dr. Hackett was eventually ruled out as a suspect by Suffolk County Police. Joseph Brewer also fell under a cloud of suspicion, since Shannon was last spotted fleeing from his home in a state of panic. However, he, too, was quickly ruled out as a suspect when Suffolk County Police could find no evidence to tie him to any of the murders. Investigator theories. For years, law enforcement remained tight-lipped on the notorious Long Island serial killer, but in 2017, the silence was at last broken. Suffolk County Assistant District Attorney Robert Biancavilla named a new suspect, John Bitrolf, a carpenter who had recently been charged with 25 years to life sentences for beating 2 sex workers to death in 1993 and 1994. Bitrolf lived in the hamlet of Manorville, where the torsos of 2 of the Long Island serial killer's victims were discovered. Biancavilla alleged that some aspects of the evidence found over the years at Ocean Parkway were similar to the earlier crimes attributed to Bitrolf. Evidence found at the crime scenes, however, did not match any found at earlier crime scenes. It was thus impossible to conclusively link Bitrolf to the murders. A hypothetical profile of the killer was created by Jim Clemente, a criminal profiler, Scott Bond, an assistant professor of sociology at Drew University, and former Nassau County Assistant District Attorney Fred Klein. They deduced that the killer was likely a white male in his mid-20s to mid-40s, he was married or had a girlfriend, he was intelligent and articulate, he had a decent job that gave him access to burlap sacks, and he lived or once lived near Ocean Parkway. A final suspect for at least some of the murders attributed to the Long Island killer is convicted serial killer Joel Rifkin. Between the years of 1989 and 1993, he murdered at least 9 women in New York and Long Island, disposing some of their bodies in the same general area as the Long Island serial killer. However, in an interview, Rifkin denied that any of the victims were his. He stated that he dumped his victims hundreds of miles apart and not in the same location, something he called the Long Island serial killer sloppy for doing. Telling the story. On that fateful night of May 1, 2010, Shannon Gilbert drove past the remote marshland where 10 victims of the Long Island serial killer lay, while en route to an escort call. Unknown to her at the time, the disturbing and mysterious events that would unfold over the forthcoming hours would forever link her to those bodies and spark one of the most extensive murder investigations in Long Island history. Numerous newspapers and magazines, a best-selling book, Lost Girls, an unsolved American mystery by Robert Coker, and an episode in the television documentary series The Killing Season have all told the story of the 10 bodies discovered along the Ocean Parkway. Despite the extensive media coverage, the case still remains unsolved and open. Case notes. Shannon's behavior led many to believe that she was on drugs or experiencing some kind of psychotic episode. No one knows who Shannon was referring to when she cried out that someone was trying to kill her. The 4 bodies were found wrapped in burlap sacks. In an effort to help capture the killer, an online petition asked authorities to grant immunity to sex workers who came forward with information. The toddler was between 16 and 24 months old and was a non-Caucasian. Jane Doe number 6 was thought to have been around 5 feet 2 in, 1.57 meters, tall and between 18 and 35 years old. On the 5th anniversary of the discovery of the first set of remains, it was announced that the FBI would join in on the investigation. In 2016, Shannon's mother, Mari Gilbert, was stabbed to death by her 27-year-old daughter, Sarah Elizabeth Gilbert, who was suffering from schizophrenia. A wrongful death lawsuit is brought by representatives of the deceased's estate. It seeks compensation from the person held to be legally at fault for the deceased's death. John Bitt Rolfe was identified as the killer of Rita Tangredet and Colleen McNamee after his brother was arrested for violating a protective order and his DNA was entered into the state database. Forensic scientists at the Suffolk County Crime Lab determined that the DNA came from a blood relative of the perpetrator of the 2 murders. There are currently 6 more murder cases being reviewed by police in an attempt to link them to the Long Island serial killer. The end.